Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. Chapter 1. The Other Minister. It was nearing midnight, and the Prime Minister was sitting alone in his office, reading a long memo that was slipping through his brain without leaving the slightest trace of meaning behind. He was waiting for a call from the president of a far-distant country, and between wondering when the wretched man would telephone and trying to suppress unpleasant memories of what had been a very long, tiring, and difficult week, there was not much space in his head for anything else. The more he attempted to focus on the print on the page before him, the more clearly the Prime Minister could see the gloating face of one of his political opponents. This particular opponent had appeared on the news that very day, not only to enumerate all the terrible things that had happened in the last week, as though anyone needed reminding, but also to explain why each and every one of them was the government's fault. The Prime Minister's pulse quickened at the very thought of these accusations, for they were neither fair nor true. How on earth was his government supposed to have stopped that bridge collapsing? It was outrageous for anybody to suggest that they were not spending enough on bridges. The bridge was less than 10 years old, and the best experts were at a loss to explain why it had snapped cleanly in two, sending a dozen cars into the watery depths of the river below. And how dared anyone suggest that it was the lack of policemen that had resulted in those two very nasty and well-publicized murders? Or that the government should have somehow foreseen the freak hurricane in the West Country that had caused so much damage to both people and property? And was it his fault that one of his junior ministers, Herbert Chorley, had chosen this week to act so peculiarly that he was now going to be spending a lot more time with his family? A grim mood has gripped the country, the opponent had concluded, barely concealing his own broad grin. And, unfortunately, this was perfectly true. The Prime Minister felt it himself. People really did seem more miserable than usual. Even the weather was dismal, all this chilly mist in the middle of July. It wasn't right. It wasn't normal. He turned over the second page of the memo, saw how much longer it went on, and gave it up as a bad job. Stretching his arms above his head, he looked around his office mournfully. It was a handsome room, with a fine marble fireplace facing the long sash windows, firmly closed against the unseasonable chill. With a slight shiver, the Prime Minister got up and moved over to the windows, looking out at the thin mist that was pressing itself against the glass. It was then, as he stood with his back to the room, that he heard a soft cough behind him. He froze, nose to nose with his own scared-looking reflection in the dark glass. He knew that cough. He had heard it before. He turned, very slowly, to face the empty room. "Hello?" he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. For a brief moment, he allowed himself the impossible hope that nobody would answer him. However, a voice responded at once, a crisp, decisive voice that sounded as though it were reading a prepared statement. It was coming, as the Prime Minister had known at the first cough, from the frog-like little man wearing a long silver wig who was depicted in a small and dirty oil painting in the far corner of the room. "To the Prime Minister of Muggles. Urgent we meet. Kindly respond immediately. Sincerely, Fudge." The man in the painting looked inquiringly at the Prime Minister. Said the Prime Minister. "Listen, it's not a very good time for me. I'm waiting for a telephone call, you see, from the President of—" "That can be rearranged," said the portrait at once. The Prime Minister's heart sank. He had been afraid of that. But I really was rather hoping to speak." "We shall arrange for the President to forget to call. He will telephone tomorrow night instead," said the little man. "Kindly respond immediately to Mr. Fudge." "Oh, very well," said the Prime Minister weakly. "Yes, I'll see Fudge." He hurried back to his desk, straightening his tie as he went. He had barely resumed his seat and arranged his face into what he hoped was a relaxed and unfazed expression, when bright green flames burst into life in the empty grate beneath his marble mantelpiece. He watched, trying to not betray a flicker of surprise or alarm, as a portly man appeared within the flames, spinning as fast as a top. Seconds later, he had climbed out onto a rather fine antique rug, brushing ash from the sleeves of his long pinstriped cloak, a lime green bowler hat in his hand. "Ah, Prime Minister," said Cornelius Fudge, striding forwards with his hand outstretched. "Good to see you again." The Prime Minister could not honestly return this compliment, so said nothing at all. He was not remotely pleased to see Fudge, whose occasional appearances, apart from being downright alarming in themselves, generally meant that he was about to hear some very bad news. Furthermore, Fudge was looking distinctly careworn. He was thinner, bolder, and greyer, and his face had a crumpled look. The Prime Minister has seen that kind of look in politicians before, and it never boded well. "How can I help you?" he said, shaking Fudge's hand very briefly and gesturing towards the hardest of the chairs in the front of the desk. "Difficult to know where to begin," muttered Fudge, pulling up the chair, sitting down and placing his green bowler upon his knees. What a week. What a week." "Had a bad one too, have you?" asked the Prime Minister stiffly, hoping to convey by this that he had quite enough on his plate already, without any extra helpings from Fudge. "Yes, of course," said Fudge, rubbing his eyes wearily and looking morosely at the Prime Minister. "I've been having the same week as you have, Prime Minister. The Brockdale Bridge, the Bones and Vance murders, not to mention the ruckus in the West Country." "You're... I mean to say, some of your people were involved in those things, were they?" Fudge fixed the Prime Minister with a rather stern look. "Of course they were," he said. "Surely you've realized what's going on." Hesitated the Prime Minister. It was precisely this sort of behaviour that made him dislike Fudge's visits so much. He was, after all, the Prime Minister, and did not appreciate being made to feel like an ignorant schoolboy. But of course, it had been like this from his very first meeting with Fudge on his very first evening as Prime Minister. He remembered it as though it were yesterday, and knew it would haunt him until his dying day. He had been standing alone in this very office, savouring the triumph that was his after so many years of dreaming and scheming, when he had heard a cough behind him, just like tonight, and turned to find that ugly little portrait talking to him, announcing that the Minister for Magic was about to arrive and introduce himself. Naturally, he had thought that the long campaign and the strain of the election had caused him to go mad. He had been utterly terrified to find a portrait talking to him, though this had been nothing to how he had felt when a self-proclaimed wizard had bounced out of the fireplace and shaken his hand. He had remained speechless throughout Fudge's kindly explanation that there were witches and wizards still living in secret all over the world, and his reassurances that he was not to bother his head about them, as the Ministry of Magic took responsibility for the whole wizarding community and prevented the non-magical population from getting wind of them. It was, said Fudge, a difficult job that encompassed everything from regulations on responsible use of broomsticks to keeping the dragon population under control. The Prime Minister remembered clutching the desk for support at this point. Fudge had then patted the shoulder of the still dumbstruck Prime Minister in a fatherly sort of way. "Not to worry," he had said. "It's odds on you'll never see me again. I'll only bother you if there's something really serious going on our end. Something that's likely to affect the Muggles. The non-magical population, I should say. Otherwise, it's live and let live. And I must say, you're taking it a lot better than your predecessor. He tried to throw me out of the window. thought I was a hoax planned by the opposition." At this, the Prime Minister had found his voice at last. You're not a hoax, then?" It had been his last desperate hope. "No," said Fudge gently. "No, I'm afraid I'm not. Look." And he had turned the Prime Minister's teacup into a gerbil. "But," said the Prime Minister breathlessly, watching his teacup chewing on the corner of his next speech, why has nobody told me?" "The Minister for Magic only reveals him or herself to the Muggle Prime Minister of the day," said Fudge, poking his wand back inside his jacket. "We find it the best way to maintain secrecy." "But then," bleated the Prime Minister, "why hasn't a former Prime Minister warned me?" At this, Fudge had actually laughed. My dear Prime Minister, are you ever going to tell anybody?" Still chortling, Fudge had thrown some powder into the fireplace, stepped into the emerald flames, and vanished with a whooshing sound. The Prime Minister had stood there, quite motionless, and realized that he would never, as long as he lived, dare mention this encounter to a living soul, for who in the wide world would believe him? The shock had taken a little while to wear off. For a time he had tried to convince himself that Fudge had indeed been a hallucination, brought on by the lack of sleep during his grueling election campaign. In a vain attempt to rid himself of all reminders of this uncomfortable encounter, he had given the gerbil to his delighted niece, and instructed his private secretary to take down the portrait of the ugly little man who would announce Fudge's arrival. To the Prime Minister's dismay, however, the portrait had proved impossible to remove. When several carpenters, a builder or two, an art historian, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer had all tried unsuccessfully to prise it from the wall, the Prime Minister had abandoned the attempt, and simply resolved to hope that the thing remained motionless and silent for the rest of his term in office. Occasionally, he could have sworn he saw out of the corner of his eye the occupant of the painting yawning, or else scratching his nose. Even once or twice, simply walking out of his frame, and leaving nothing but a stretch of muddy brown canvas behind. However, he had trained himself not to look at the picture very much, and always to tell himself firmly that his eyes were playing tricks on him when anything like this happened. Then, 3 years ago, on a night very like tonight, the Prime Minister had been alone in his office when the portrait had once again announced the imminent arrival of Fudge, who had burst out of the fireplace, sopping wet and in a state of considerable panic. Before the Prime Minister could ask why he was dripping all over the Axminster, Fudge had started ranting about a prison the Prime Minister had never heard of, a man named Sirius Black, something that sounded like Hogwarts, and a boy called Harry Potter, none of which made the remotest sense to the Prime Minister. "I've just come from Azkaban," Fudge had panted, tipping a large amount of water out of the rim of his bowler hat into his pocket. "Middle of the North Sea, you know. Nasty flight. The Dementors are in uproar," he shuddered. "They've never had a breakout before. Anyway, I had to come to you, Prime Minister. Black's a known Muggle killer and may be planning to rejoin you-know-who. But of course you don't even know who you-know-who is." He gazed hopelessly at the Prime Minister for a moment, then said, "Well, sit down. I'd better fill you in. Have a whiskey." The Prime Minister had rather resented being told to sit down in his own office, let alone offered his own whiskey, but he sat nevertheless. Fudge had pulled out his wand, conjured 2 large glasses full of amber liquid out of thin air, pushed one of them into the Prime Minister's hand, and drawn up a chair. Fudge had talked for over an hour. At one point, he had refused to say a certain name aloud, and wrote it instead on a piece of parchment, which he had thrust into the Prime Minister's whiskey-free hand. When at last Fudge had stood up to leave, the Prime Minister had stood up too. "So you think that," he had squinted down at the name in his left hand, "Lord Vol—" "He who must not be named," snarled Fudge. "I'm sorry. You think that he who must not be named is still alive, then?" Well, Dumbledore says he is, said Fudge, as he had fastened his pinstriped cloak under his chin. But we've never found him. If you ask me, he's not dangerous unless he's got support. So it's Black we ought to be worrying about. You'll put out that warning then? Excellent. Well, I hope we don't see each other again, Prime Minister. Good night. But they had seen each other again. Less than a year later, a harassed-looking Fudge had appeared out of thin air in the cabinet room to inform the Prime Minister that there had been a spot of bother at the Quidditch, or at least that was what it sounded like, World Cup, and that several Muggles had been involved. But that the Prime Minister was not to worry. The fact that you-know-whose mark had been seen again meant nothing. Fudge was sure it was an isolated incident, and the Muggle liaison office was dealing with all memory modifications as they spoke. Oh, and I almost forgot, Fudge had added. We're importing 3 foreign dragons and a sphinx for the Triwizard Tournament. Quite routine, but the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures tells me that it's down in the rule book that we have to notify you if we're bringing highly dangerous creatures into the country. What? Dragons? Spluttered the Prime Minister. Yes, 3, said Fudge, and a sphinx. Well, good day to you. The Prime Minister had hoped beyond hope that dragons and sphinxes would be the worst of it. But no, less than 2 years later, Fudge had erupted out of the fire yet again, this time with the news that there had been a mass breakout from Azkaban. A mass breakout? The Prime Minister had repeated hoarsely. No need to worry, Fudge had shouted, already with one foot in the flames. We'll have them rounded up in no time. Just thought you ought to know. And before the Prime Minister had been able to shout, Now wait just one moment, Fudge had vanished in a shower of green sparks. Whatever the press and the opposition might say, the Prime Minister was not a foolish man. It had not escaped his notice that, despite Fudge's assurances at their first meeting, they were now seeing rather a lot of each other, nor that Fudge was becoming more flustered with each visit. Little though he liked to think about the Minister for Magic, or as he always called Fudge in his head, the other Minister, the Prime Minister could not help but fear that the next time Fudge appeared, it would be with graver news still. The sight, therefore, of Fudge stepping out of the fire once more, looking dishevelled and fretful, and sternly surprised that the Prime Minister did not know exactly why he was there, was about the worst thing that had happened in the course of this extremely gloomy week. How should I know what's going on in the, wizarding community? Snapped the Prime Minister now. I have a country to run and quite enough concerns at the moment without... We have the same concerns, Fudge interrupted. The Brockdale Bridge didn't wear out. That wasn't really a hurricane. Those murders were not the work of Muggles, and Herbert Chorley's family would be safer without him. We are currently making arrangements to have him transferred to St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies and injuries. The move should be effected tonight. What do you... I'm afraid What? Blustered the Prime Minister. Fudge took a great, deep breath and said, Prime Minister, I am very sorry to have to tell you that he's back. He who must not be named is back. Back? When you say back, he's alive. I mean... The Prime Minister groped in his memory for the details of that horrible conversation of 3 years previously, when Fudge had told him about a wizard who was feared above all others, the wizard who had committed 1,000 terrible crimes before his mysterious disappearance 15 years earlier. Yes, alive, said Fudge. That is, I don't know. Is a man alive if he can't be killed? I don't really understand it, and Dumbledore won't explain properly. But anyway, he's certainly got a body in his walking and talking and killing. So I suppose, for the purposes of our discussion, yes, he's alive. The Prime Minister did not know what to say to this. but a persistent habit of wishing to appear well-informed on any subject that came up made him cast around for any details he could remember of their previous conversation. "Is Sirius Black with, he who must not be named?" "Black? Black?" said Fudge distractedly, turning his bowler rapidly in his fingers. "Sirius Black, you mean?" "Merlin's beard, no. Black's dead. Turns out we were, mistaken about Black. He was innocent after all, and he wasn't in league with he who must not be named either, I mean," he added defensively, spinning the bowler hat still faster. "All the evidence pointed. We had more than 50 eyewitnesses. But anyway, as I say, he's dead. Murdered, as a matter of fact, on Ministry of Magic premises. There's going to be an inquiry, actually." To his great surprise, the Prime Minister felt a fleeting stab of pity for Fudge at this point. It was, however, eclipsed almost immediately by a glow of smugness at the thought that, deficient though he himself might be in the area of materializing out of fireplaces, there had never been a murder in any of the government departments under his charge. Not yet, anyway. While the Prime Minister surreptitiously touched the wood of his desk, Fudge continued. "But Black's by the by now. The point is, we're at war, Prime Minister, and steps must be taken." "At war?" repeated the Prime Minister nervously. "Surely that's a little bit of an overstatement." "He who must not be named has now been joined by those of his followers who broke out of Azkaban in January," said Fudge, speaking more and more rapidly, and twirling his bowler so fast that it was a lime-green blur. "Since they have moved into the open, they have been wreaking havoc. The Brockdale Bridge, he did it, Prime Minister. He threatened a mass Muggle killing unless I stood aside for him, and... Good grief. So it's your fault those people were killed, and I'm having to answer questions about rusted rigging and corroded expansion joints, and I don't know what else," said the Prime Minister furiously. "My fault?" said Fudge, colouring up. "Are you saying you would have caved into blackmail like that?" "Maybe not," said the Prime Minister, standing up and striding about the room. "But I would have put all my efforts into catching the blackmailer before he committed any such atrocity." "Do you really think I wasn't already making every effort?" demanded Fudge heatedly. "Every aura in the Ministry was, and is, trying to find him and round up his followers. But we happen to be talking about one of the most powerful wizards of all time, a wizard who has eluded a capture for almost 3 decades. "So I suppose you're going to tell me he caused the hurricane in the West Country too," said the Prime Minister, his temper rising with every pace he took. It was infuriating to discover the reason for all these terrible disasters, and not to be able to tell the public. Almost worse than it being the government's fault, after all. "That was no hurricane," said Fudge miserably. "Excuse me?" barked the Prime Minister, now positively stamping up and down. "Trees uprooted, roofs ripped off, lampposts bent, horrible injuries." "It was the Death Eaters," said Fudge. "He who must not be named's followers. And we suspect giant involvement." The Prime Minister stopped in his tracks as though he had hit an invisible wall. "What involvement?" Fudge grimaced. "He used giants last time, when he wanted to go for the grand effect. The Office of Misinformation has been working round the clock. We've had teams of obliviators out trying to modify the memories of all the Muggles who saw what really happened. We've got most of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures running around Somerset, but we can't find the giant. It's been a disaster." "You don't say," said the Prime Minister furiously. "I won't deny that morale is pretty low at the Ministry," said Fudge. "What with all that, and then losing Amelia Bones." Losing who?" Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. We think he who must not be named may have murdered her in person, because she was a very gifted witch, and all the evidence was that she put up a real fight. Fudge cleared his throat and, with an effort, it seemed, stopped spinning his bowler hat. "But that murder was in the newspapers," said the Prime Minister, momentarily diverted from his anger. "Our newspapers. Amelia Bones. It just said she was a middle-aged woman who lived alone. It was a nasty killing, wasn't it? It's had a rather lot of publicity. The police are baffled, you see." Fudge sighed. "Well, of course they are. Killed in a room that was locked from the inside, wasn't she? We, on the other hand, know exactly who did it. Not that it gets us any further towards catching him. And then there was Emmeline Vance. Maybe you didn't hear about that one." "Oh, yes, I did," said the Prime Minister. It happened just round the corner from here, as a matter of fact. The papers had a field day with it. Breakdown of law and order in the Prime Minister's backyard." And as if all that wasn't enough, said Fudge, barely listening to the Prime Minister, "we've got Dementors swarming all over the place, attacking people left, right, and centre." Once upon a happier time, the sentence would have been unintelligible to the Prime Minister, but he was wiser now. "I thought Dementors guard the prisoners in Azkaban," he said cautiously. "They did," said Fudge warily, "but not any more. They've deserted the prison and joined he who must not be named. I won't pretend that wasn't a blow." "But," said the Prime Minister with a sense of dawning horror, "didn't you tell me they're the creatures that drain hope and happiness out of people?" "That's right, and they're breeding. That's what's causing all this mist." The Prime Minister sank, weak-kneed, into the nearest chair. The idea of invisible creatures swooping through the towns and countryside, spreading despair and hopelessness in his voters, made him feel quite faint. "Now see here, Fudge. You've got to do something. It's your responsibility as Minister for Magic." "My dear Prime Minister, you can't honestly think I'm still Minister for Magic after all this? I was sacked 3 days ago. The whole wizarding community has been screaming for my resignation for a fortnight. I've never known them so united in my whole term of office," said Fudge, with a brave attempt at a smile. The Prime Minister was momentarily lost for words. Despite his indignation at the position into which he had been placed, he still rather felt for the shrunken-looking man sitting opposite him. "I'm very sorry," he said finally. "If there's anything I can do." "It's very kind of you, Prime Minister, but there is nothing. I was sent here tonight to bring you up to date on recent events and to introduce you to my successor. I rather thought he'd be here by now, but of course he's very busy at the moment, with so much going on." Fudge looked round at the portrait of the ugly little man wearing the long, curly silver wig, who was digging in his ear with the point of a quill. Catching Fudge's eye, the portrait said, "He'll be here in a moment. He's just finishing a letter to Dumbledore." "I wish him luck," said Fudge, sounding bitter for the first time. "I've been writing to Dumbledore twice a day for the past fortnight, but he won't budge. If he'd just been prepared to persuade the boy, I might still be... well, maybe Scrimgeour will have more success." Fudge subsided into what was clearly an aggrieved silence, but it was broken almost immediately by the portrait, which suddenly spoke in its crisp official voice. "To the Prime Minister of Muggles, requesting a meeting. Urgent. Kindly respond immediately. Rufus Scrimgeour, Minister for Magic." Yes, fine," said the Prime Minister distractedly, and he barely flinched as the flames in the grate turned emerald green again, rose up and revealed a second spinning wizard in their heart, disgorging him moments later onto the antique rug. Fudge got to his feet, and after a moment's hesitation, the Prime Minister did the same, watching the new arrival straighten up, dust down his long black robes, and look around. The Prime Minister's first foolish thought was that Rufus Scrimgeour looked rather like an old lion. There were streaks of grey in his mane of tawny hair and his bushy eyebrows. He had keen, yellowish eyes behind a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles and a certain rangy, loping grace, even though he walked with a slight limp. There was an immediate impression of shrewdness and toughness. The Prime Minister thought he understood why the wizarding community preferred Scrimgeour to Fudge as a leader in these dangerous times. "How do you do?" said the Prime Minister politely, holding out his hand. Scrimgeour grasped it briefly, his eyes scanning the room, then pulled out a wand from under his robes. "Fudge told you everything?" he asked, striding over to the door and tapping the keyhole with his wand. The Prime Minister heard the lock click. Yes," said the Prime Minister. "And if you don't mind, I'd rather that door remained unlocked." "I'd rather not be interrupted," said Scrimgeour shortly. "Or watched," he added, pointing his wand at the window so that the curtain swept across them. "Right. Well, I'm a busy man, so let's get down to business. First of all, we need to discuss your security." The Prime Minister drew himself up to his fullest height and replied, "I am perfectly happy with the security I've already got, thank you very." "Well, we're not," Scrimgeour cut in. "It'll be a poor lookout for the Muggles if their Prime Minister gets put under the Imperious curse. The new secretary in your outer office—" "I'm not getting rid of Kingsley Shacklebolt, if that's what you're suggesting," said the Prime Minister hotly. "He's highly efficient. Gets through twice the work the rest of them." "That's because he's a wizard," said Scrimgeour, without a flicker of a smile. "A highly trained aura who has been assigned to you for your protection." "Now wait a moment," declared the Prime Minister. "You can't just put your people into my office. I decide who works for me." "I thought you were happy with Shacklebolt," said Scrimgeour coldly. "I am. That's to say, I was." "Then there's no problem, is there?" said Scrimgeour. Well, as long as Shacklebolt's work continues to be, excellent," said the Prime Minister lamely, but Scrimgeour barely seemed to hear him. "Now, about Herbert Chorley, your junior minister," he continued, "the one who has been entertaining the public by impersonating a duck." "What about him?" he asked the Prime Minister. "He has clearly reacted to a poorly performed Imperious curse," said Scrimgeour. "It's addled his brains, but he could still be dangerous." "He's only quacking," said the Prime Minister weakly. "Surely a bit of a rest. Maybe go easy on the drink." "A team of healers from St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries is examining him as we speak. So far, he has attempted to strangle 3 of them," said Scrimgeour. "I think it best that we remove him from Muggle society for a while." Well, he'll be all right, won't he?" said the Prime Minister anxiously. Scrimgeour merely shrugged, already moving back towards the fireplace. "Well, that's really all I had to say. I'll keep you posted of developments, Prime Minister. Or at least, I shall probably be too busy to come personally, in which case I shall send Fudge here. He has consented to stay on in an advisory capacity." Fudge attempted to smile, but was unsuccessful. He merely looked as though he had toothache. Scrimgeour was already rummaging in his pocket for the mysterious powder that turned the fire green. The Prime Minister gazed hopelessly at the pair of them for a moment. Then the words he had fought to suppress all evening burst from him at last. "But for heaven's sake, you're wizards. You can do magic. Surely you can sort out, well, anything." Scrimgeour turned slowly on the spot and exchanged an incredulous look with Fudge, who really did manage a smile this time as he said kindly, "The trouble is, the other side can do magic too, Prime Minister." And with that, the two wizards stepped, one after the other, into the bright green fire and vanished. Chapter 2. Spinner's End. Many miles away, the chilly mist that had pressed against the Prime Minister's windows drifted over a dirty river that wound between overgrown, rubbish-strewn banks. An immense chimney, relic of a disused mill, reared up, shadowy and ominous. There was no sound apart from the whisper of the black water, and no sign of life apart from a scrawny fox that had slunk down the bank to nose hopefully at some old fish and chip wrappings in the tall grass. But then, with a very faint pop, a slim, hooded figure appeared out of thin air on the edge of the river. The fox froze, wary eyes fixed upon this strange new phenomenon. The figure seemed to take its bearings for a few moments, then set off with light, quick strides, its long cloak rustling over the grass. With a second and rather louder pop, another hooded figure materialized. "Wait!" The harsh cry startled the fox, now crouching almost flat in the undergrowth. It yelped from its hiding place and up the bank. There was a flash of green light, a yelp, and the fox fell back to the ground, dead. A second figure turned over the animal with its toe. "Just a fox," said the woman's voice dismissively from under her hood. "I thought perhaps an aura." "Sissy, wait!" But her quarry, who had paused and looked back at the flash of light, was already scrambling up the bank the fox had just fallen down. "Sissy, Narcissa, listen to me!" The second woman caught the first and seized her arm, but the other wrenched it away. "Go back, Bella." "You must listen to me." "I've listened already. I've made my decision. Leave me alone." The woman called Narcissa gained the top of the bank, where a line of old railings separated the river from a narrow cobbled street. The other woman, Bella, followed at once. Side by side, they stood looking across the road at the rows and rows of dilapidated brick houses, their windows dull and blind in the darkness. "He lives here?" asked Bella in a voice of contempt. "Here? In this muggle dunghill? We must be the first of our kind ever to set foot." But Narcissa was not listening. She had slipped through a gap in the rusty railings and was already hurrying across the road. "Sissy, wait!" Bella followed, her cloak streaming behind, and saw Narcissa darting through an alley between the houses into a second, almost identical street. Some of the street lamps were broken. The two women were running between patches of light and deep darkness. The pursuer caught up with her prey just as she turned another corner, this time succeeding in catching hold of her arm and swinging her round so that they faced each other. "Sissy, you must not do this. You can't trust him." "The Dark Lord trusts him, doesn't he?" "The Dark Lord is, I believe, mistaken," Bella panted, and her eyes gleamed momentarily under her hood as she looked around to check that they were indeed alone. "In any case, we were not told not to speak of the plan to anyone. This is a betrayal of the Dark Lords." "Let go, Bella!" snarled Narcissa as she drew her wand from beneath her cloak, holding it threateningly in the other's face. Bella merely laughed. "Sissy, your own sister? You wouldn't." "There is nothing I wouldn't do any more," Narcissa breathed, a note of hysteria in her voice. And as she brought down the wand like a knife, there was another flash of light. Bella let go of her sister's arm as though it burned. "Narcissa!" But Narcissa had rushed ahead, rubbing her hand. Her pursuer followed again, keeping her distance now. As they moved deeper into the deserted labyrinth of brick houses, At last, Narcissa hurried up a street called Spinner's End, over which the towering mill chimney seemed to hover like a giant admonitory finger. Her footsteps echoed on the cobbles as she passed boarded and broken windows, until she reached the very last house, where a dim light glimmered through the curtains in a downstairs room. She had knocked on the door before Bella, cursing under her breath, had caught up. Together they stood waiting, panting slightly, breathing in the smell of the dirty river that was carried to them on the night breeze. After a few seconds, they heard movement behind the door, and it opened a crack. A sliver of a man could be seen looking out at them, a man with long, black hair parted in curtains around a sallow face and black eyes. Narcissa threw back her hood. She was so pale that she seemed to shine in the darkness. The long, blonde hair streaming down her back gave her the look of a drowned person. "Narcissa," said the man, opening the door a little wider, so that the light fell upon her and her sister too. "What a pleasant surprise!" "Severus," she said in a strained whisper, "may I speak to you? It's urgent." "But of course." He stood back to allow her to pass him into the house. Her still hooded sister followed without invitation. "Snape," she said curtly as he passed him. "Bellatrix," he replied, his thin mouth curling into a slightly mocking smile as he closed the door with a snap behind them. They had stepped directly into a tiny sitting room, which had the feeling of a dark, padded cell. The walls were completely covered in books, most of them bound in old black or brown leather. A threadbare sofa, an old armchair, and a rickety table stood grouped together in a pool of dim light cast by a candle-filled lamp hung from the ceiling. The place had an air of neglect, as though it were not usually inhabited. Snape gestured Narcissa to the sofa. She threw off her cloak, cast it aside, and sat down, staring at her white and trembling hands clasped in her lap. Bellatrix lowered her hood more slowly. Dark as her sister was fair, with heavily lidded eyes and a strong jaw. She did not take her gaze from Snape as she moved to stand behind Narcissa. "So, what can I do for you?" Snape asked, settling himself in the armchair opposite the two sisters. We are alone, aren't we?" Narcissa asked quietly. "Yes, of course." "Well, Wormtail's here." "But we're not counting vermin, are we?" He pointed his wand at the wall of books behind him, and with a bang a hidden door flew open, revealing a narrow staircase upon which a small man stood frozen. "As you have clearly realized, Wormtail, we have guests," said Snape lazily. The man crept hunchbacked down the last few steps and moved into the room. He had small, watery eyes, a pointed nose, and wore an unpleasant simper. His left hand was caressing his right, which looked as though it were encased in a bright silver glove. "Narcissa," he said in a squeaky voice, "and Bellatrix! How charming!" "Wormtail will get us drinks, if you'd like them," said Snape, "and then he will return to his bedroom." Wormtail winced as though Snape had thrown something at him. "I am not your servant," he squeaked, avoiding Snape's eye. "Really? I was under the impression that the Dark Lord placed you here to assist me." "To assist, yes, but not make you drinks and clean your house." "I had no idea, Wormtail, that you were craving more dangerous assignments," said Snape silkily. "This can be easily arranged. I shall speak to the Dark Lord." "I can speak to him myself if I want to." "Of course you can," said Snape, sneering. "But in the meantime, bring us drinks. Some of the elf-made wine will do." Wormtail hesitated for a moment, looking as though he might argue. but then turned and headed for a second hidden door. They heard banging and a clinking of glasses. Within seconds, he was back, bearing a dusty bottle and 3 glasses upon a tray. He dropped these on the rickety table and scurried from their presence, slamming the book-covered door behind him. Snape poured out 3 glasses of blood-red wine and handed 2 of them to the sisters. Narcissa murmured a word of thanks, whilst Bellatrix said nothing, but continued to glower at Snape. This did not seem to decompose him. On the contrary, he looked rather amused. "The Dark Lord," he said, raising his glass and draining it. The sisters copied him. Snape refilled their glasses. As Narcissa took her second drink, she said in a hush, "Severus, I'm sorry to come here like this, but I had to see you. I think you are the only one who can help me." Snape held up a hand to stop her, then pointed his wand again at the concealed staircase door. There was a loud bang and a squeal, followed by the sound of Wormtails scurrying back up the stairs. "My apologies," said Snape. "He has lately taken to listening at doors. I don't know what he means by it." "You were saying, Narcissa?" She took a great, shuddering breath and started again. "Severus, I know I ought not to be here. I have been told to say nothing to anyone, but—" "Then you ought to hold your tongue," snarled Bellatrix, "particularly in present company." "Present company?" repeated Snape sardonically. "And what am I to understand by that, Bellatrix?" "That I don't trust you, Snape, as you very well know." Narcissa let out a noise that might have been a dry sob and covered her face with her hands. Snape set his glass down upon the table and sat back again, his hands upon the arms of his chair, smiling into Bellatrix's glowering face. "Narcissa, I think we ought to hear what Bellatrix is bursting to say. It will save tedious interruptions." "Well, continue, Bellatrix," said Snape. "Why is it that you do not trust me?" "100 reasons," she said loudly, striding out from behind the sofa to slam her glass upon the table. "Where to start? Where were you when the Dark Lord fell? Why did you never make any attempt to find him when he vanished? What have you been doing all these years that you've lived in Dumbledore's pocket? Why did you stop the Dark Lord procuring the Philosopher's Stone? Why did you not return at once when the Dark Lord was reborn? Where were you a few weeks ago when we battled to retrieve the prophecy for the Dark Lord? And why, Snape, is Harry Potter still alive when you have had him at your mercy for 5 years?" She paused, her chest rising and falling rapidly, the colour high in her cheeks. Behind her, Narcissa sat motionless, her face still hidden in her hands. Snape smiled. "Before I answer you—" "Oh yes, Bellatrix, I am going to answer." "You can carry my words back to the others who whisper behind my back, and carry false tales of my treachery to the Dark Lord. Before I answer you, I say, let me ask a question in turn. Do you really think that the Dark Lord has not asked me each and every one of those questions? And do you really think that had I not been able to give satisfactory answers, I would be sitting here talking to you?" She hesitated. "I know he believes you, but—" "You think he is mistaken? Or that I have somehow hoodwinked him? Fooled the Dark Lord, the greatest wizard, the most accomplished legilimens the world has ever seen?" Bellatrix said nothing, but looked for the first time a little discomfited. Snape did not press the point. He picked up his drink again, sipped it, and continued. "You ask where I was when the Dark Lord fell. I was where he had ordered me to be, at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, because he wished me to spy upon Albus Dumbledore. You know, I presume, that it was on the Dark Lord's orders that I took up the post." She nodded almost imperceptibly and then opened her mouth, but Snape forestalled her. You ask why I did not attempt to find him when he vanished. For the same reason that Avery, Yaxley, the Cowrows, Greyback, Lucius, he inclined his head slightly to Narcissa, and many others did not attempt to find him. I believed him finished. I am not proud of it. I was wrong. But there it is. If he had not forgotten we who lost faith at that time, we would have very few followers left. He'd have me, said Bellatrix passionately. I, who spent many years in Azkaban for him. Yes, indeed. Most admirable, said Snape in a bored voice. Of course, you weren't a lot of use to him in prison, but the gesture was undoubtedly fine. Gesture? She shrieked. In her fury, she looked slightly mad. While I endured the Dementors, you remained at Hogwarts, comfortably playing Dumbledore's pet. Not quite, said Snape calmly. He wouldn't give me the defense against the dark arts job, you know. Seemed to think it might, bring about a relapse, tempt me into my old ways. This was your sacrifice for the Dark Lord not to teach your favourite subject, she jeered. Why did you stay there all that time, Snape, still spying on Dumbledore for a master you believed dead? Hardly, said Snape, although the Dark Lord is pleased that I never deserted my post. I had 16 years of information on Dumbledore to give him when he returned. A rather more useful welcome back present than endless reminiscences of how unpleasant Azkaban is. But you stayed. Yes, Bellatrix, I stayed, said Snape, betraying a hint of impatience for the first time. I had a comfortable job that I preferred to a stint in Azkaban. They were rounding up the Death Eaters, you know. Dumbledore's protection kept me out of jail. It was most convenient, and I used it. I repeat, the Dark Lord does not complain that I stayed, so I do not see what you do. I think you next wanted to know, he pressed on, a little more loudly, for Bellatrix showed every sign of interrupting, why I stood between the Dark Lord and the Philosopher's Stone. That is easily answered. He did not know whether he could trust me. He thought, like you, that I had turned from faithful Death Eater to Dumbledore's stooge. He was in a pitiable condition, very weak, sharing the body of a mediocre wizard. He did not dare reveal himself to a former ally, if that ally might turn him over to Dumbledore or the Ministry. I deeply regret that he did not trust me. He would have returned to power 3 years sooner. As it was, I saw only greed and unworthy Quirrell attempting to steal the stone, and, I admit, I did all I could to thwart him. Bellatrix's mouth twisted as though she had taken an unpleasant dose of medicine. But you didn't return when he came back. You didn't fly back to him at once when you felt the dark mark burn. Correct. I returned 2 hours later. I returned on Dumbledore's orders. On Dumbledore's? She began in tones of outrage. Think, said Snape, impatient again. Think. By waiting 2 hours, just 2 hours, I ensured that I could remain at Hogwarts as a spy. By allowing Dumbledore to think that I was only returning to the Dark Lord's side because I was ordered to. I have been able to pass information on Dumbledore and the Order of the Phoenix ever since. Consider, Bellatrix, the dark mark had been growing stronger for months. I knew he must be about to return. All the Death Eaters knew. I had plenty of time to think about what I wanted to do, to plan my next move. To escape like Karkaroff, didn't I? The Dark Lord's initial displeasure at my lateness vanished entirely, I assure you, when I explained that I remained faithful, although Dumbledore thought I was his man. Yes, the Dark Lord thought that I had left him forever. But he was wrong.
But what use have you been? Sneered Bellatrix. What useful information have we had from you?
My information has been conveyed directly to the Dark Lord, said Snape. If he chooses not to share it with you.
He shares everything with me, said Bellatrix, firing up at once. He calls me his most loyal, his most faithful.
Does he? Said Snape, his voice delicately inflected to suggest his disbelief. Does he still? After the fiasco at the Ministry?
That was not my fault, said Bellatrix, flushing. The Dark Lord has, in the past, entrusted me with his most precious. If Lucius hadn't... Don't you dare blame my husband, said Narcissa in a low and deadly voice, looking up at her sister.
There is no point apportioning blame, said Snape smoothly. What is done is done.
But not by you, said Bellatrix furiously. No, you were once again absent while the rest of us ran dangers. Were you not, Snape?
My orders were to remain behind, said Snape. Perhaps you disagree with the Dark Lord. Perhaps you think that Dumbledore would not have noticed if I had joined forces with the Death Eaters to fight the Order of the Phoenix. And, forgive me, you speak of dangers. You were facing 6 teenagers, were you not? They were joined, as you very well know, by half of the Order before long, snarled Bellatrix. And, while we are on the subject of the Order, you still claim you cannot reveal the whereabouts of their headquarters, don't you? I am not the secret keeper. I cannot speak the name of the place. You understand how the enchantment works, I think. The Dark Lord is satisfied with the information I have passed him on the Order. It led, as perhaps you have guessed, to the recent capture and murder of Emmeline Vance. And it certainly helped dispose of Sirius Black, though I give you full credit for finishing him off. He inclined his head and toasted her. Her expression did not soften. You are avoiding my last question, Snape. Harry Potter, you could have killed him at any point in the past 5 years. You have not done it. Why? Have you discussed this matter with the Dark Lord? Asked Snape. I am asking you, Snape. If I had murdered Harry Potter, the Dark Lord could not have used his blood to regenerate, making him invincible. You claim you foresaw his use of the boy? She jeered. I do not claim it. I had no idea of his plans. I have already confessed that I thought the Dark Lord dead. I am merely trying to explain why the Dark Lord is not sorry that Potter survived. At least until a year ago. But why did you keep him alive? Have you not understood me? It was only Dumbledore's protection that was keeping me out of Azkaban. Do you disagree that murdering his favourite student might have turned him against me? But there was more to it than that. I should remind you that when Potter first arrived at Hogwarts, there were still many stories circulating about him, rumours that he himself was a great dark wizard, which was how he had survived the Dark Lord's attack. Indeed, many of the Dark Lord's old followers thought Potter might be a standard around which we could all rally once more. I was curious, I admit it, and not at all inclined to murder him the moment he set foot in the castle. Of course, it became apparent to me very quickly that he had no extraordinary talent at all. He has fought his way out of a number of tight corners by a simple combination of sheer luck and more talented friends. He is mediocre to the last degree.
though as obnoxious and self-satisfied as was his father before him. I have done my utmost to have him thrown out of Hogwarts, where I believe he scarcely belongs. But kill him, or allow him to be killed in front of me? I would have been a fool to risk it, with Dumbledore close at hand. And through all this, we are supposed to believe Dumbledore has never suspected you? Asked Bellatrix. He has no idea of your true allegiance? He trusts you implicitly still? I have played my part well, said Snape, and you overlook Dumbledore's greatest weakness. He has to believe the best of people. I spun him a tale of deepest remorse when I joined his staff, fresh from my Death Eater days, and he embraced me with open arms. Though, as I say, never allowing me nearer the dark arts than he could help. Dumbledore has been a great wizard. Oh yes, he has, for Bellatrix had made a scathing noise. The Dark Lord acknowledges it. I am pleased to say, however, that Dumbledore is growing old. The duel with the Dark Lord last month shook him. He has since sustained a serious injury because his reactions are slower than they once were. But through all these years, he has never stopped trusting Severus Snape, and therein lies my great value to the Dark Lord. Bellatrix still looked unhappy, though she appeared unsure how best to attack Snape next. Taking advantage of her silence, Snape turned to her sister. Now, you came to ask me for help, Narcissa. Narcissa looked up at him, her face eloquent with despair. Yes, Severus. I think you are the only one who can help me. I have nowhere else to turn. Lucius is in jail, and... She closed her eyes and 2 large tears seeped from beneath her eyelids. The Dark Lord has forbidden me to speak of it, Narcissa continued, her eyes still closed. He wishes none to know of the plan. It is very secret, but... If he has forbidden it, you ought not to speak, said Snape at once. The Dark Lord's word is law. Narcissa gasped as though he had doused her with cold water. Bellatrix looked satisfied for the first time since she had entered the house. There, she said triumphantly to her sister. Even Snape says so. You were told not to talk, so hold your silence. But Snape had got to his feet and strode to the small window, peered through the curtains at the deserted street, then closed them again with a jerk. He turned around to face Narcissa, frowning. It so happens that I know of the plan, he said in a low voice. I am one of the few the Dark Lord has told. Nevertheless, had I not been in on the secret, Narcissa, you would have been guilty of great treachery to the Dark Lord. I thought you must know about it, said Narcissa, breathing more freely. He trusts you so, Severus. You know about the plan? said Bellatrix, her fleeting expression of satisfaction replaced by a look of outrage. You knew? Certainly, said Snape. But what help do you require, Narcissa? If you are imagining I can persuade the Dark Lord to change his mind, I am afraid there is no hope. None at all. Severus, she whispered, tears sliding down her pale cheeks. My son. My only son. Draco should be proud, said Bellatrix indifferently. The Dark Lord is granting him a great honour. And I will say this for Draco. He isn't shrinking away from his duty. He seems glad of a chance to prove himself. Excited at the prospect. Narcissa began to cry in earnest, gazing beseechingly all the while at Snape. That's because he is 16 and has no idea what lies in store. Why, Severus? Why my son? It's too dangerous. This is vengeance for Lucius's mistake. I know it. Snape said nothing. He looked away from the sight of her tears as though they were indecent, but he could not pretend not to hear her. That's why he's chosen Draco, isn't it? She persisted. To punish Lucius. If Draco succeeds, said Snape, still looking away from her. He will be honored above all others. But he won't succeed, sobbed Narcissa. How can he, when the Dark Lord himself... Bellatrix gasped. Narcissa seemed to lose her nerve. I only meant that nobody has yet succeeded. Severus, please. You have always been Draco's favourite teacher. You are Lucius's old friend. I beg you. You are the Dark Lord's favourite, his most trusted adviser. Will you not speak to him? Persuade him? The Dark Lord will not be persuaded, and I am not stupid enough to attempt it, said Snape flatly. I cannot pretend that the Dark Lord is not angry with Lucius. Lucius was supposed to be in charge. He got himself captured, along with how many others, and failed to retrieve the prophecy into the bargain. Yes, the Dark Lord is angry, Narcissa. Very angry indeed. Then I am right. He has chosen Draco in revenge, choked Narcissa. He does not mean him to succeed. He wants him to be killed trying. When Snape said nothing, Narcissa seemed to lose what little self-restraint she still possessed. Standing up, she staggered to Snape and seized the front of his robes, her face close to his, her tears falling onto his chest. She gasped, You could do it! You could do it instead of Draco! Severus, you would succeed! Of course you would! And he would reward you beyond all of us! Snape caught hold of her wrists and removed her clutching hands. Looking down into her tear-stained face, he said slowly, He intends me to do it in the end, I think. But he is determined that Draco should try first. You see, in the unlikely event that Draco succeeds, I shall be able to remain at Hogwarts a little longer, fulfilling my useful role as spy. In other words, it doesn't matter to him if Draco is killed. The Dark Lord is very angry, repeated Snape quietly. He failed to hear the prophecy. You know as well as I do, Narcissa, that he does not forgive easily. She crumpled, falling at his feet, sobbing and moaning on the floor. My only son! My only son! You should be proud, said Bellatrix ruthlessly. If I had sons, I would be glad to give them up to the service of the Dark Lord. Narcissa gave a little scream of despair and clutched at her long blonde hair. Snape stooped, seized her by the arms, lifted her up, and steered her back onto the sofa. He then poured her more wine and forced the glass into her hand. Narcissa, that's enough. Drink this. Listen to me. She quietened a little, slopping wine down herself. She took a shaky sip. It might be possible for me to help Draco. She sat up, her face paper white, her eyes huge. Severus? Oh, Severus, you would help him? Would you look after him? See he comes to no harm? I can try. She flung away her glass. It skidded across the table as she slid off the sofa into a kneeling position at Snape's feet, seized his hand in both of hers, and pressed her lips to it. If you are there to protect him, Severus, will you swear it? Will you make the unbreakable vow? The unbreakable vow? Snape's expression was blank, unreadable. Bellatrix, however, let out a cackle of triumphant laughter. Aren't you listening, Narcissa? Oh, he'll try, I'm sure. The usual empty words, the usual slithering out of action. Oh, on the Dark Lord's orders, of course. Snape did not look at Bellatrix. His black eyes were fixed upon Narcissa's tear-filled blue ones as she continued to clutch his hand. Certainly, Narcissa. I shall make the unbreakable vow, he said quietly. Perhaps your sister will consent to being our bonder? Bellatrix's mouth fell open. Snape lowered himself so that he was kneeling opposite Narcissa, beneath Bellatrix's astonished gaze. They grasped right hands. "You will need your wand, Bellatrix," said Snape coldly. She drew it, still looking astonished. "And you will need to move a little closer," he said. She stepped forward so that she stood over them, and placed the tip of her wand on their linked hands. Narcissa spoke. "Will you, Severus, watch over my son Draco as he attempts to fulfill the Dark Lord's wishes?" "I will," said Snape. A thin tongue of brilliant flame issued from the wand and wound its way around their hands like a red-hot wire. "And will you, to the best of your ability, protect him from harm?" "I will," said Snape. A second tongue of flame shot from the wand and interlinked with the first, making a fine, glowing chain. "And, should it prove necessary, if it seems Draco will fail," whispered Narcissa. Snape's hand twitched within hers, but he did not draw away. "Will you carry out the deed that the Dark Lord has ordered Draco to perform?" There was a moment's silence. Bellatrix watched, her hand upon their clasped hands, her eyes wide. "I will," said Snape. Bellatrix's astounded face glowed red in the blaze of a third tongue of flame, which shot from the wand, twisted with the others, and bound itself thickly around their clasped hands, like a rope, like a fiery snake. Chapter 3. Will and Won't. Harry Potter was snoring loudly. He had been sitting in a chair beside his bedroom window for the best part of 4 hours, staring out at the darkening street, and had finally fallen asleep with one side of his face pressed against the cold window pane, his glasses askew and his mouth wide open. The misty fog his breath had left on the window sparkled in the orange glare of the street lamp outside, and the artificial light drained his face of all colour so that he looked ghostly beneath his shock of untidy black hair. The room was strewn with various possessions and a good smattering of rubbish. Owl feathers, apple cores, and sweet wrappers littered the floor. A number of spellbooks lay higgledy-piggledy among the tangled robes on his bed, and a mess of newspapers sat in a puddle of light on his desk. The headline of one blared, "Harry Potter, the Chosen One?" Rumours continued to fly about the mysterious recent disturbance at the Ministry of Magic, during which he who must not be named was sighted once more. "We're not allowed to talk about it. Don't ask me anything," said one agitated obliviator, who refused to give his name as he left the ministry last night. Nevertheless, highly placed sources within the ministry have confirmed that the disturbance centered on the fabled Hall of Prophecy. Though ministry spokeswizards have hitherto refused even to confirm the existence of such a place, a growing number of the wizarding community believe that the Death Eaters now serving sentences in Azkaban for trespass and attempted theft were attempting to steal a prophecy. The nature of that prophecy is unknown, although speculation is rife that it concerns Harry Potter, the only person ever known to have survived the killing curse, and who is also known to have been at the ministry on the night in question. Some are going so far as to call Potter the Chosen One, believing that the prophecy names him as the only one who will be able to rid us of he who must not be named. The current whereabouts of the prophecy, if it exists, are unknown, although, continued, page 2, column 5. A second newspaper lay beside the first. This one bore the headline, "Scrimgeour Succeeds Fudge." Most of this front page was taken up with a large black and white picture of a man with a lion-like mane of thick hair and a rather ravaged face. The picture was moving. The man was waving at the ceiling. Rufus Scrimgeour, previously head of the Aura Office in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, has succeeded Cornelius Fudge as Minister for Magic. The appointment has largely been greeted with enthusiasm by the wizarding community, though rumours of a rift between the new minister and Albus Dumbledore, newly reinstated Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, surfaced within hours of Scrimgeour taking office. Scrimgeour's representatives admitted that he had met with Dumbledore at once upon taking possession of the top job, but refused to comment on the topics under discussion.
Albus Dumbledore is known to... Continued, page 3, column 2. To the left of this newspaper sat another, which had been folded so that a story bearing the title Ministry Guarantees Student Safety was visible. Newly appointed Minister for Magic, Rufus Scrimgeour, spoke today of the tough new measures taken by his ministry to ensure the safety of the students returning to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry this autumn. For obvious reasons, the ministry will not be going into detail about its stringent new security plans, said the minister, although an insider confirmed that measures include defensive spells and charms, a complex array of counter-curses, and a small task force of auras dedicated solely to the protection of Hogwarts School. Most seemed reassured by the new minister's tough stand on student safety, said Mrs. Augusta Longbottom. My grandson, Neville, a good friend of Harry Potter's, incidentally, who fought the Death Eaters alongside him at the Ministry in June, and... But the rest of this story was obscured by the large birdcage standing on top of it. Inside it was a magnificent snowy owl. Her amber eyes surveyed the room imperiously, her head swivelling occasionally to gaze at her snoring master. Once or twice she clicked her beak impatiently, but Harry was too deeply asleep to hear her. A large trunk stood in the very middle of the room. Its lid was open. It looked expectant, yet it was almost empty but for a residue of old underwear, sweets, empty ink bottles, and broken quills that coated the very bottom. Nearby, on the floor, lay a purple leaflet emblazoned with the words, "Issued on behalf of the Ministry of Magic, protecting your home and family against dark forces. The wizarding community is currently under threat from an organization calling itself the Death Eaters. Observing the following simple security guidelines will help protect you, your family, and your home from attack. 1. You are advised not to leave the house alone. 2. Particular care should be taken during the hours of darkness. Whenever possible, arrange to complete journeys before night has fallen. 3. Review the security arrangements around your house, making sure that all family members are aware of emergency measures such as shield and delusionment charms and, in the case of underage family members, side-along apparition. 4. Agree security questions with close friends and family so as to detect Death Eaters masquerading as others by use of Polyjuice Potion. See page 2. 5. Should you feel that a family member, colleague, friend, or neighbor is acting in a strange manner, contact the Magical Law Enforcement Squad at once. They may have been put under the Imperious Curse. See page 4. 6. Should the Dark Mark appear over any dwelling place or other building, do not enter, but contact the Aura office immediately. 7. Unconfirmed sightings suggest that the Death Eaters may now be using Inferi. See page 10. Any sighting of an Inferius or encounter with same should be reported to the Ministry immediately. Harry grunted in his sleep, and his face slid down the window an inch or so, making his glasses still more lopsided. But he did not wake up. An alarm clock, repaired by Harry several years ago, ticked loudly on the sill, showing 1 minute to 11. Beside it, held in place by Harry's relaxed hand, was a piece of parchment covered in thin, slanted writing. Harry had read this letter so often since its arrival 3 days ago that, although it had been delivered in a tightly felt scroll, it now lay quite flat. Dear Harry, if it is convenient to you, I shall call at number 4 Privet Drive this coming Friday at 11 p.m. to escort you to the Burrow, where you have been invited to spend the remainder of your school holidays. If you are agreeable, I should also be glad of your assistance in a matter to which I hope to attend on the way to the Burrow. I shall explain this more fully when I see you. Kindly send your answer by return of this owl. Hoping to see you this Friday. I am yours most sincerely, Albus Dumbledore. Though he already knew it by heart, Harry had been stealing glances at this missive every few minutes since 7 o'clock that evening, when he had first taken up his position beside his bedroom window, which had a reasonable view of both ends of Privet Drive. He knew it was pointless to keep rereading Dumbledore's words. Harry had sent back his yes with the delivering owl as requested, and all he could do now was wait. Either Dumbledore was going to come, or he was not. But Harry had not packed. It just seemed too good to be true that he was going to be rescued from the Dursleys after a mere fortnight of their company. He could not shrug off the feeling that something was going to go wrong. His reply to Dumbledore's letter might have gone astray. Dumbledore could be prevented from collecting him. The letter might not turn out to be from Dumbledore at all, but a trick or joke or trap. Harry had not been able to face packing and then being let down and having to unpack again. The only gesture he had made to the possibility of a journey was to shut his snowy owl Hedwig safely in her cage. The minute hand on the alarm clock reached the number 12, and at the precise moment, the street lamp outside the window went out. Harry awoke as though the sudden darkness was an alarm. Hastily straightening his glasses and unsticking his cheek from the glass, he pressed his nose against the window instead and squinted down at the pavement. A tall figure in a long, billowing cloak was walking up the garden path. Harry jumped up as though he had received an electric shock, knocked over his chair, and started snatching anything and everything within reach from the floor and throwing it into the trunk. Even as he lobbed a set of robes, 2 spellbooks, and a packet of crisps across the room, the doorbell rang. Downstairs in the living room, his Uncle Vernon shouted, "Who the blazes is calling at this time of night?" Harry froze with the brass telescope in one hand and a pair of trainers in the other. He had completely forgotten to warn the Dursleys that Dumbledore might be coming. Feeling both panicky and close to laughter, he clambered over the trunk and wrenched open his bedroom door, in time to hear a deep voice say, "Good evening. You must be Mr. Dursley. I dare say Harry has told you I would be coming for him." Harry ran down the stairs 2 at a time, coming to an abrupt halt several steps from the bottom, as long experience had taught him to remain out of arm's reach of his uncle whenever possible. There in the doorway stood a tall, thin man with waist-length silver hair and beard. Half-moon spectacles were perched on his crooked nose, and he was wearing a long, black travelling cloak and a pointed hat. Vernon Dursley, whose moustache was quite as bushy as Dumbledore's, though black, and who was wearing a puce dressing gown, was staring at the visitor as although he could not believe his tiny eyes. "Judging by your look of stunned disbelief, Harry did not warn you that I was coming," said Dumbledore pleasantly. "However, let us assume that you have invited me warmly into your house. It is unwise to linger over long on doorsteps in these troubled times." He stepped smartly over the threshold and closed the front door behind him. "It is a long time since my last visit," said Dumbledore, peering down his crooked nose at Uncle Vernon. "I must say, your acquaintances are flourishing." Vernon Dursley said nothing at all. Harry did not doubt that speech would return to him, and soon the vein pulsing in his uncle's temple was reaching danger point. But something about Dumbledore seemed to have robbed him temporarily of breath. It might have been the blatant wizardishness of his appearance, but it might too have been that even Uncle Vernon could sense that here was a man whom it would be very difficult to bully. "Ah, good evening, Harry," said Dumbledore, looking up at him through his half-moon glasses with a most satisfied expression. "Excellent. Excellent." These words seemed to rouse Uncle Vernon. It was clear that as far as he was concerned, any man who could look at Harry and say "excellent" was a man with whom he could never see eye to eye. "I don't mean to be rude," he began, in a tone that threatened rudeness in every syllable. "Yet, sadly, accidental rudeness occurs alarmingly often," Dumbledore finished the sentence gravely. "Best to say nothing at all, my dear man. Ah, and this must be Petunia." The kitchen door had opened, and there stood Harry's aunt, wearing rubber gloves and a housecoat over her nightdress, clearly halfway through her usual pre-bedtime wipe-down of all the kitchen surfaces. Her rather horsey face registered nothing but shock. "Albus Dumbledore," said Dumbledore, when Uncle Vernon failed to effect an introduction. "We have corresponded, of course." Harry thought this an odd way of reminding Aunt Petunia that he had once sent her an exploding letter. But Aunt Petunia did not challenge the term. "And this must be your son, Dudley." Dudley had that moment peered around the living room door. His large blonde head, rising out of the stripy collar of his pajamas, looked oddly disembodied, his mouth gaping in astonishment and fear. Dumbledore waited a moment or two, apparently to see whether any of the Dursleys were going to say anything, but as the silence stretched on, he smiled. "Shall we assume that you have invited me into your sitting room?" Dudley scrambled out of the way as Dumbledore passed him. Harry, still clutching the telescope and trainers, jumped the last few stairs and followed Dumbledore, who had settled himself in the armchair nearest the fire and was taking in the surroundings with an expression of benign interest. He looked quite extraordinarily out of place. Aren't we leaving, sir?" Harry asked anxiously. "Yes, indeed we are, but there are a few matters we need to discuss first," said Dumbledore, "and I would prefer not to do so in the open. We shall trespass upon your aunt and uncle's hospitality only a little longer." "You will you?" Vernon Dursley had entered the room, Petunia at his shoulder, and Dudley skulking behind them both. "Yes," said Dumbledore simply, "I shall." He drew his wand so rapidly that Harry barely saw it. With a casual flick, the sofa zoomed forwards and knocked the knees out from under all three of the Dursleys, so that they collapsed upon it in a heap. Another flick of the wand, and the sofa zoomed back to its original position. "We may as well be comfortable," said Dumbledore pleasantly. As he replaced his wand in his pocket, Harry saw that his hand was blackened and shriveled. It looked as though his flesh had been burned away. "Sir, what happened to your—" "Later, Harry," said Dumbledore. "Please, sit down." Harry took the remaining armchair, choosing not to look at the Dursleys, who seemed stunned into silence. "I would assume that you were going to offer me refreshment," Dumbledore said to Uncle Vernon. "But the evidence so far suggests that would be optimistic to the point of foolishness." A third twitch of the wand, and a dusty bottle and 5 glasses appeared in mid-air. The bottle tipped and poured a generous measure of honey-coloured liquid into each of the glasses, which then floated to each person in the room. "Madame Rismerta's finest oak-matured mead," said Dumbledore, raising his glass to Harry, who caught hold of his own and sipped. He had never tasted anything like it before, but enjoyed it immensely. The Dursleys, after quick, scared looks to each other, tried to ignore their glasses completely. A difficult feat, as they were nudging them gently on the sides of their heads. Harry could not suppress a suspicion that Dumbledore was rather enjoying himself. "Well, Harry," said Dumbledore, turning towards him, "a difficulty has arisen which I hope you will be able to solve for us. By us, I mean the Order of the Phoenix. But first of all, I must tell you that Sirius's will was discovered a week ago, and that he left you everything he owned." Over on the sofa, Uncle Vernon's head turned, but Harry did not look at him, nor could he think of anything to say except, "Oh, right." "This, in the main, fairly straightforward," Dumbledore went on. "You add a reasonable amount of gold to your account at Gringotts, and you inherit all of Sirius's personal possessions. The slightly problematic part of the legacy." "His godfather's dead?" said Uncle Vernon loudly from the sofa. Dumbledore and Harry both turned to look at him. The glass of mead was now knocking quite incessantly on the side of Vernon's head. He attempted to beat it away. He's dead? His godfather?" "Yes," said Dumbledore. He did not ask Harry why he had not confided in the Dursleys. "Our problem," he continued to Harry, as if there had been no interruption, "is that Sirius also left you number 12, Grimmauld Place." "He's been left a house?" said Uncle Vernon greedily, his small eyes narrowing, but nobody answered him. You can keep using it as headquarters, said Harry. I don't care. You can have it. I don't really want it. Harry never wanted to set foot in number 12 Grimmauld Place again if he could help it. He thought he would be haunted forever by the memory of Sirius prowling its dark, musty rooms alone, imprisoned within the place he had wanted so desperately to leave. That is generous, said Dumbledore. We have, however, vacated the building temporarily. Why? Well, said Dumbledore, ignoring the mutterings of Uncle Vernon, who was now being rapped smartly over the head by the persistent glass of mead. Black family tradition decreed that the house was handed down the direct line to the next male with the name of Black. Sirius was the very last of the line, and his younger brother, Regulus, predeceased him, and both were childless. While his will makes it perfectly plain that he wants you to have the house, it is nevertheless possible that some spell or enchantment has been set upon the place to ensure that it cannot be owned by anyone other than a pure-blood. A vivid image of the shrieking, spitting portrait of Sirius's mother that hung in the hall of number 12 Grimmauld Place flashed into Harry's mind. I bet there has, he said. Quite, said Dumbledore. And if such an enchantment exists, then the ownership of the house is most likely to pass to the eldest of Sirius's living relatives, which would mean his cousin, Bellatrix Lestrange. Without realizing what he was doing, Harry sprang to his feet. The telescope and trainers in his lap rolled across the floor. Bellatrix Lestrange, Sirius's killer, inherit his house? No, he said. Well, obviously, we would prefer that she didn't get it either, said Dumbledore calmly. The situation is fraught with complications. We do not know whether the enchantments we find we ourselves have placed upon it, for example, making it unplottable, will hold now that ownership has passed from Sirius's hands. It might be that Bellatrix will arrive on the doorstep at any moment. Naturally, we had to move out until such time as we have clarified the position. But how are you going to find out if I'm allowed to own it? Fortunately, said Dumbledore, there is a simple test. He placed his empty glass on the small table beside his chair, but before he could do anything else, Uncle Vernon shouted, Will you get these ruddy things off us? Harry looked round. All three of the Dursleys were cowering with their arms over their heads as their glasses bounced up and down on their skulls, the contents flying everywhere. Oh, I'm so sorry, said Dumbledore politely, and he raised his wand again. All three glasses vanished. But it would have been better manners to drink it, you know. It looked as though Uncle Vernon was bursting with any number of unpleasant retorts, but he merely sank back into the cushions with Aunt Petunia and Dudley, and said nothing, keeping his small picky eyes on Dumbledore's wand. You see, Dumbledore said, turning back to Harry, and again speaking as though Uncle Vernon had not uttered, if you have indeed inherited the house, you have also inherited... He flicked his wand for a fifth time. There was a loud crack, and a house elf appeared, with a snout for a nose, giant bat's ears, and enormous bloodshot eyes, crouching on the Dursleys' shag-piled carpet and covered in grimy rags. Aunt Petunia let out a hair-raising shriek. Nothing this filthy had entered her house in living memory. Dudley drew his large, bare pink feet off the floor and sat with them raised almost above his head, as though he thought the creature might run up his pyjama trousers, and Uncle Vernon bellowed, What the hell is that? Creature, finished Dumbledore. Creature won't! Creature won't! Creature won't! Croaked the house elf, quite as loudly as Uncle Vernon, stamping his long gnarled feet and pulling his ears. Creature belongs to Miss Bellatrix. Oh yes, creature belongs to the Blacks. Creature wants his new mistress. Creature won't go to the Potter brat. Creature won't. As you can see, Harry, said Dumbledore loudly, over Creature's continued croaks of won't, Creature is showing a certain reluctance to pass into your ownership. I don't care, said Harry again, looking with disgust at the writhing, stamping house elf. I don't want him.
Won't.
You would prefer him to pass into the ownership of Bellatrix Lestrange? Bearing in mind that he has lived at the headquarters of the Order of the Phoenix for the past year?
Won't.
Harry stared at Dumbledore. He knew that Creature could not be permitted to go and live with Bellatrix Lestrange, but the idea of owning him, of having responsibility for the creature that had betrayed Sirius, was repugnant. Give him an order, said Dumbledore. If he has passed into your ownership, he will have to obey. If not, then we shall have to think of some other means of keeping him from his rightful mistress.
Won't.
Creature's voice had risen to a scream. Harry could think of nothing to say except, Creature, shut up. It looked for a moment as though Creature was going to choke. He grabbed his throat, his mouth still working furiously, his eyes bulging. After a few seconds of frantic gulping, he threw himself face forwards onto the carpet, Aunt Petunia whimpered, and beat the floor with his hands and feet, giving himself over to a violent but entirely silent tantrum. Well, that simplifies matters, said Dumbledore cheerfully. It seems that Sirius knew what he was doing. You are the rightful owner of number 12 Grimmauld Place, and of Creature. Do I have to keep him with me? Harry asked, aghast, as Creature thrashed around at his feet. Not if you don't want to, said Dumbledore. If I might make a suggestion, you could send him to Hogwarts to work in the kitchen there. In that way, the other house elves could keep an eye on him. Yeah, said Harry in relief. Yeah, I'll do that. Creature, I want you to go to Hogwarts and work in the kitchens there with the other house elves. Creature, who was now lying flat on his back with his arms and legs in the air, gave Harry one upside-down look of deepest loathing, and with another loud crack, vanished. Good, said Dumbledore. There is also the matter of the hippogriff Buckbeak. Hagrid has been looking after him since Sirius died. But Buckbeak is yours now, so if you'd prefer to make different arrangements... No, said Harry at once. He can stay with Hagrid. I think Buckbeak would prefer that. Hagrid will be delighted, said Dumbledore, smiling. He was thrilled to see Buckbeak again. Incidentally, we have decided, in the interests of Buckbeak's safety, to rechristen him Witherwings for the time being, though I doubt that the Ministry would ever guess he is the hippogriff that they once sentenced to death. Now, Harry, is your trunk packed? Doubtful that I would turn up, Dumbledore suggested shrewdly. I'll just go and, finish off, said Harry hastily, hurrying to pick up his fallen telescope and trainers. It took him a little over 10 minutes to track down everything he needed. At last, he managed to extract his invisibility cloak from under the bed, screwed the top back on his jar of coloured change ink, and forced the lid of his trunk shut on its cauldron. Then, heaving his trunk in one hand and holding Hedwig's cage in the other, he made his way back downstairs. He was disappointed to discover that Dumbledore was not waiting in the hall, which meant he had to return to the living room. Nobody was talking. Dumbledore was humming quietly, apparently quite at his ease. But the atmosphere was thicker than cold custard, and Harry did not dare to look at the Dursleys as he said, Professor, I'm ready now. Good, said Dumbledore. Just one last thing, then. And he turned to speak to the Dursleys once more. As you will no doubt be aware, Harry comes of age in a year's time. No, said Aunt Petunia, speaking for the first time since Dumbledore's arrival. I'm sorry, said Dumbledore politely. No, he doesn't. He's a month younger than Dudley, and Dudders doesn't turn 18 until the year after next. Ah, said Dumbledore pleasantly.
But in the wizarding world, we come of age at 17. Uncle Vernon muttered preposterous, but Dumbledore ignored him. Now, as you already know, the wizard called Lord Voldemort has returned to this country. The wizarding community is currently in a state of open warfare. Harry, whom Lord Voldemort has already attempted to kill on a number of occasions, is in even greater danger now than the day when I left him upon your doorstep 15 years ago, with a letter explaining about his parents' murder and expressing the hope that you would care for him as though he were your own. Dumbledore paused, and although his voice remained light and calm, and he gave no obvious sign of anger, Harry felt a kind of chill emanating from him, and noticed that the Dursleys drew very slightly closer together. You did not do as I asked. You have never treated Harry as a son. He has known nothing but neglect and often cruelty at your hands. The best that can be said is that he has at least escaped the appalling damage you have inflicted upon the unfortunate boy sitting between you. Both Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon looked around instinctively, as though expecting to see someone other than Dudley squeezed between them. Us? Mistreat others? What do you... began Uncle Vernon furiously, but Dumbledore raised his finger for silence, a silence which fell as though he had struck Uncle Vernon dumb. The magic I evoked 15 years ago means that Harry has powerful protection while he can still call this house home. However miserable he has been here, however unwelcome, however badly treated, you have at least grudgingly allowed him house room. This magic will cease to operate the moment that Harry turns 17. In other words, the moment he becomes a man. I ask only this, that you allow Harry to return once more to this house before his 17th birthday, which will ensure that the protection continues until that time. None of the Dursleys said anything. Dudley was frowning slightly, as though he was still trying to work out when he had ever been mistreated. Uncle Vernon looked as though he had something stuck in his throat. Aunt Petunia, however, was oddly flushed. Well, Harry, time for us to be off, said Dumbledore at last, standing up and straightening his long black cloak. Until we meet again, he said to the Dursleys, who looked as though that moment could wait forever as far as they were concerned. And after doffing his hat, he swept from the room. Bye, said Harry hastily to the Dursleys, and followed Dumbledore, who paused beside Harry's trunk, upon which Hedwig's cage was perched. We do not want to be encumbered by these just now, he said, pulling out his wand again. I shall send them to the burrow to await us there. However, I would like you to bring your invisibility cloak, just in case. Harry extracted his cloak from his trunk with some difficulty, trying not to show Dumbledore the mess within. When he had stuffed it into an inside pocket of his jacket, Dumbledore waved his wand, and the trunk, cage, and Hedwig vanished. Dumbledore then waved his wand again, and the front door opened onto cool, misty darkness. And now, Harry, let us step out into the night and pursue that flighty temptress, adventure.
Chapter 4. Horace Slughorn. Despite the fact that he had spent every waking moment of the past few days hoping desperately that Dumbledore would indeed come to fetch him, Harry felt distinctly awkward as they set off down Privet Drive together. He had never had a proper conversation with his headmaster outside of Hogwarts before. There was usually a desk between them. The memory of their last face-to-face encounter kept intruding too, and it rather heightened Harry's sense of embarrassment. He had shouted a lot on that occasion, not to mention doing his best to smash several of Dumbledore's most prized possessions. Dumbledore, however, seemed completely relaxed. Keep your wand at the ready, Harry, he said brightly. But I thought I'm not allowed to use magic outside school, sir. If there is an attack, said Dumbledore, I give you permission to use any counterjinx or curse that might occur to you. However, I do not think you need worry about being attacked tonight. Why not, sir? You are with me, said Dumbledore simply. This will do, Harry. He came to an abrupt halt at the end of Privet Drive.
You have not, of course, passed your apparition test, he said. No, said Harry. I thought you had to be 17. You do, said Dumbledore. So you will need to hold on to my arm very tightly. My left, if you don't mind. As you have noticed, my wand arm is a little fragile at the moment. Harry gripped Dumbledore's pre-offered arm. Very good, said Dumbledore. Well, here we go. Harry felt Dumbledore's arm twist away from him and redoubled his grip. The next thing he knew, everything went black. He was being pressed very hard from all directions. He could not breathe. There were iron bands tightening around his chest. His eyeballs were being forced back into his head. His eardrums were being pushed deeper into his skull. And then he gulped great lungfuls of cold night air and opened his streaming eyes. He felt as though he had just been forced through a very tight rubber tube. It was a few seconds before he realized that Privet Drive had vanished. He and Dumbledore were now standing in what appeared to be a deserted village square, in the center of which stood an old war memorial and a few benches. His comprehension catching up with his senses, Harry realized that he had just apparated for the first time in his life. Are you all right? Asked Dumbledore, looking down at him solicitously. The sensation does take some getting used to. I'm fine, said Harry, rubbing his ears, which felt as though they had left Privet Drive rather reluctantly. But I think I might prefer brooms. Dumbledore smiled, drew his travelling cloak a little more tightly around his neck, and said, This way? He set off at a brisk pace, past an empty inn and a few houses. According to a clock on a nearby church, it was almost midnight. So, tell me, Harry, said Dumbledore, your scar, has it been hurting at all? Harry raised a hand unconsciously to his forehead and rubbed the lightning-shaped mark. No, he said. And I've been wondering about that. I thought it would be burning all the time now Voldemort's getting so powerful again. He glanced up at Dumbledore and saw that he was wearing a satisfied expression. I, on the other hand, thought otherwise, said Dumbledore. Lord Voldemort has finally realized the dangerous access to his thoughts and feelings you have been enjoying. It appears that he is now employing occlumency against you. Well, I'm not complaining, said Harry, who missed neither the disturbing dreams nor the startling flashes of insight into Voldemort's mind. They turned a corner, passing a telephone box and a bus shelter. Harry looked sideways at Dumbledore again. Professor? Harry? Where exactly are we? This, Harry, is the charming village of Budley Babbitton. And what are we doing here? Ah, yes, of course, I haven't told you, said Dumbledore. Well, I have lost count of the number of times I have said this in recent years, but we are, once again, one member of staff short. We are here to persuade an old colleague of mine to come out of retirement and return to Hogwarts. How can I help with that, sir? Oh, I think we'll find a use for you, said Dumbledore vaguely. Left here, Harry. They proceeded up a steep, narrow street lined with houses. All the windows were dark. The odd chill that had lain over Privet Drive for 2 weeks persisted here, too. Thinking of Dementors, Harry cast a look over his shoulder and grasped his wand reassuringly in his pocket. Professor, why couldn't we just apparate directly into your old colleague's house? Because that would be quite as rude as kicking down the front door, said Dumbledore. Courtesy dictates that we offer fellow wizards the opportunity of denying us entry. In any case, most wizarding dwellings are magically protected from unwanted apparators. At Hogwarts, for instance. You can't apparate anywhere inside the buildings or grounds, said Harry quickly. Hermione Granger told me. And she is quite right. We turned left again. The church clock chimed midnight behind them. Harry wondered why Dumbledore did not consider it rude to call on his old colleagues so late, but now that conversation had been established, he had more pressing questions to ask. Sir, I saw in the Daily Prophet that Fudge has been sacked. Correct, said Dumbledore, now turning up a steep side street. He has been replaced. As I am sure you also saw,
by Rufus Scrimgeour, who used to be the head of the Aura office. Is he... Do you think he's good? Asked Harry. An interesting question, said Dumbledore. He is able, certainly. A more decisive and forceful personality than Cornelius. Yes, but I know what you meant. Rufus is a man of action, and having fought dark wizards for most of his working life, does not underestimate Lord Voldemort. Harry waited, but Dumbledore did not say anything about the disagreement with Scrimgeour that the Daily Prophet had reported. And he did not have the nerve to pursue the subject, so he changed it. And, sir, I saw about Madame Bones. Yes, said Dumbledore quietly. Terrible loss. She was a great witch. Just up here, I think. Ouch! He had pointed with his injured hand. Professor, what happened to your... I have no time to explain now, said Dumbledore. It is a thrilling tale. I wish to do it justice. He smiled at Harry, who understood that he was not being snubbed, and that he had permission to keep asking questions. Sir, I got a Ministry of Magic leaflet by Owl about security measures we should all take against the Death Eaters. Yes, I received one myself, said Dumbledore, still smiling. Did you find it useful? Not really. No, I thought not. You have not asked me, for instance, what is my favourite flavour of jam, to check that I am indeed Professor Dumbledore and not an imposter. I didn't, Harry began, not entirely sure whether he was being reprimanded or not. For future reference, Harry, it is raspberry. Although, of course, if I were a Death Eater, I would have been sure to research my own jam preferences before impersonating myself. Right, said Harry. Well, on that leaflet, it said something about inferi. What exactly are they? The leaflet wasn't very clear. They are corpses, said Dumbledore calmly. Dead bodies that have been bewitched to do a dark wizard's bidding. Inferi have not been seen for a long time. However, not since Voldemort was last powerful. He killed enough people to make an army of them, of course. This is the place, Harry. Just here. They were nearing a small, neat stone house set in its own garden. Harry was too busy digesting the horrible idea of Inferi to have much attention left for anything else. But as they reached the front gate, Dumbledore stopped dead and Harry walked into him. Oh dear. Oh dear. Dear, dear. Harry followed his gaze up the carefully tended front path and felt his heart sink. The front door was hanging off its hinges. Dumbledore glanced up and down the street. It seemed quite deserted. Wand out and follow me, Harry, he said quietly. He opened the gate and walked swiftly and silently up the garden path, Harry at his heels, then pushed the front door very slowly, his wand raised and at the ready. Lumos. Dumbledore's wand tip ignited, casting its light up a narrow hallway. To the left, another door stood open. Holding his illuminated wand aloft, Dumbledore walked into the sitting room with Harry right behind him. A scene of total devastation met their eyes. A grandfather clock lay splintered at their feet, its face cracked, its pendulum lying a little further away like a dropped sword. A piano was on its side, its keys strewn across the floor. The wreckage of a fallen chandelier glittered nearby. Cushions lay deflated, feathers oozing from slashes in their sides. Fragments of glass and china lay like powder over everything. Dumbledore raised his wand even higher, so that its light was thrown upon the walls, where something darkly red and gluttonous was splattered over the wallpaper. Harry's small intake of breath made Dumbledore look round. Not pretty, is it? He said heavily. Yes, something horrible has happened here. Dumbledore moved carefully into the middle of the room, scrutinizing the wreckage at his feet. Harry followed, gazing around, half scared of what he might see hidden behind the wreck of the piano or the overturned sofa. But there was no sign of a body. Maybe there was a fight and they dragged him off, Professor,
Harry suggested, trying not to imagine how badly wounded a man might have to be to leave those stains splattered halfway up the walls. I don't think so, said Dumbledore quietly, peering behind an overstuffed armchair lying on its side. You mean he's still here somewhere? Yes. And without warning, Dumbledore swooped, plunging the tip of his wand into the seat of the overstuffed armchair, which yelled, "Ouch!" Good evening, Horace, said Dumbledore, straightening up again. Harry's jaw dropped. Where a split second before there had been an armchair, there now crouched an enormously fat, bald old man who was massaging his lower belly and squinting up at Dumbledore with an aggrieved and watery eye. There was no need to stick the wand in that hard, he said gruffly, clambering to his feet. It hurt. The wand light sparkled on his shiny pate, his prominent eyes, his enormous silver walrus-like moustache, and the highly polished buttons on the maroon velvet jacket he was wearing over a pair of lilac silk pajamas. The top of his head barely reached Dumbledore's chin. What gave it away? He grunted as he staggered to his feet, still rubbing his lower belly. He seemed remarkably unabashed for a man who had just been discovered pretending to be an armchair. My dear Horace, said Dumbledore, looking amused, if the Death Eaters really had come to call, the dark mark would have been set over the house. The wizard clapped a pudgy hand to his vast forehead. The dark mark? He muttered. Knew there was something. Well, wouldn't have had time anyway. I'd only just put the finishing touches to my upholstery when you entered the room. He heaved a great sigh that made the ends of his moustache flutter. Would you like my assistance clearing up? Asked Dumbledore politely. Please, said the other. They stood back to back, the tall, thin wizard and the short, round one, and waved their wands in one identical sweeping motion. The furniture flew back to its original place. Ornaments reformed in midair, feathers zoomed into their cushions, torn books repaired themselves as they landed upon their shelves. Oil lanterns soared onto the side tables and reignited. A vast collection of splintered silver picture frames flew glittering across the room and alighted, whole and untarnished. Upon a desk, rips, cracks, and holes healed everywhere, and the walls wiped themselves clean. What kind of blood was that, incidentally? Asked Dumbledore loudly over the chiming of the newly unsmashed grandfather clock. On the walls? Dragon! Shouted the wizard called Horace, as with a deafening grinding and tinkling, the chandelier screwed itself back into the ceiling. There was a final plunk from the piano, and silence. Yes, dragon, repeated the wizard conversationally. My last bottle, and prices are sky high at the moment. Still, it might be reusable. He stumped over to the small crystal ball standing on top of a sideboard and held it up to the light, examining the thick liquid within. Bit dusty. He set the bottle back on the sideboard and sighed. It was then that his gaze fell upon Harry. Oh, he said, his large round eyes flying to Harry's forehead and the lightning-shaped scar it bore. Oh. This, said Dumbledore, moving forwards to make the introduction, is Harry Potter. Harry, this is an old friend and colleague of mine, Horace Slughorn. Slughorn turned on Dumbledore, his expression shrewd. So that's how you thought you'd persuade me, is it? Well, the answer's no, Albus. He pushed past Harry, his face turned resolutely away with the air of a man trying to resist temptation. I suppose we can have a drink at least? Asked Dumbledore. For old time's sake? Slughorn hesitated. All right, then, one drink, he said ungraciously. Dumbledore smiled at Harry and directed him towards a chair not unlike the one that Slughorn had so recently impersonated, which stood right beside the newly burning fire and a brightly glowing oil lamp. Harry took the seat with the distinct impression that Dumbledore, for some reason, wanted to keep him as visible as possible. Certainly, when Slughorn, who had been busy with decanters and glasses, turned to face the room again, his eyes fell immediately upon Harry. He said, looking away quickly as though frightened of hurting his eyes. Here. He gave a drink to Dumbledore, who sat down without invitation, thrust the tray at Harry,
and then sank into the cushions of the repaired sofa and a disgruntled silence. His legs were so short that they did not touch the floor. "Well, how have you been keeping, Horace?" Dumbledore asked. "Not so well," said Slughorn at once. "Weak chest, wheezy. Rheumatism, too. Can't move like I used to." "Well, that's to be expected. Old age, fatigue." "And yet you must have moved fairly quickly to prepare such a welcome for us at such short notice," said Dumbledore. "You can't have had more than 3 minutes' warning?" Slughorn said half irritably, half proudly, "2. Didn't hear my intruder alarm go off. I was taking a bath. Still," he added sternly, seeming to pull himself back together again, "the fact remains that I'm an old man, Albus. A tired old man who's earned the right to a quiet life and a few creature comforts." He certainly had those, thought Harry, looking around the room. It was stuffy and cluttered, yet nobody could say it was uncomfortable. There were soft chairs and footstools, drinks and books, boxes of chocolates and plump cushions. If Harry had not known who lived there, he would have guessed at a rich, fussy old lady. "You're not yet as old as I am, Horace," said Dumbledore. "Well, maybe you ought to think about retirement yourself," said Slughorn bluntly. His pale gooseberry eyes had found Dumbledore's injured hand. "Reactions not what they were, I see." "You're quite right," said Dumbledore serenely, shaking back his sleeve to reveal the tips of those burned and blackened fingers. The sight of them made the back of Harry's neck prickle unpleasantly. "I am undoubtedly slower than I was, but on the other hand—" He shrugged and spread his hands wide, as though to say that age had its compensations, and Harry noticed a ring on his uninjured hand that he had never seen Dumbledore wear before. It was large, rather clumsily made of what looked like gold, and was set with a heavy black stone that had cracked down the middle. Slughorn's eyes lingered for a moment on the ring too, and Harry saw a tiny frown momentarily crease his wide forehead. "So, all these precautions against intruders, Horace, are they for the Death Eater's benefit? Or mine?" asked Dumbledore. "What would the Death Eaters want with a poor, broken-down old buffer like me?" demanded Slughorn. "I imagine that they would want you to turn your considerable talents to coercion, torture, and murder," said Dumbledore. "Are you really telling me that they haven't come recruiting yet?" Slughorn eyed Dumbledore balefully for a moment, then muttered, "I haven't given them the chance. I've been on the move for a year. Never stay in one place more than a week. Move from Muggle house to Muggle house. The owners of this place are on holiday in the Canary Islands. It's been very pleasant. I'll be sorry to leave. It's quite easy once you know how. One simple freezing charm on these absurd burglar alarms they use instead of sneakoscopes, and make sure the neighbours don't spot you bringing in the piano." "Ingenious," said Dumbledore. "But it sounds a rather tiring existence for a broken-down old buffer in search of a quiet life. Now, if you were to return to Hogwarts—" "If you're going to tell me my life would be more peaceful at that pestilential school, you can save your breath, Albus. I might have been in hiding, but some funny rumors have reached me since Dolores Umbridge left, if that's how you treat teachers these days." "Professor Umbridge ran afoul of our centaur herd," said Dumbledore. "I think you, Horace, would have known better than to stride into the forest and call a horde of angry centaurs filthy half-breeds." "That's what she did she?" said Slughorn. "Idiotic woman. Never liked her." Harry chuckled, and both Dumbledore and Slughorn looked around at him. "Sorry," said Harry hastily. It's just, I didn't like her either." Dumbledore stood up rather suddenly. "Are you leaving?" asked Slughorn at once, looking hopeful. "No, I was wondering whether I might use your bathroom," said Dumbledore. "Oh," said Slughorn, clearly disappointed. "Second on the left down the hall." Dumbledore crossed the room. Once the door had closed behind him, there was silence. After a few moments, Slughorn got to his feet, but seemed uncertain what to do with himself. He shot a furtive look at Harry, then strode to the fire and turned his back on it, warming his wide behind. "Don't think I don't know why he's brought you," he said abruptly. Harry merely looked at Slughorn.
Slughorn's watery eyes slid over Harry's scar, this time taking in the rest of his face. You look very much like your father. Yeah, I've been told, said Harry. Except for your eyes, you've got my mother's eyes, yeah. Harry had heard it so often he found it a bit wearing. Humph. Yes, well, you shouldn't have favourites as a teacher, of course. But she was one of mine, your mother, Slughorn added, in answer to Harry's questioning look. Lily Evans, one of the brightest I ever taught. Vacacious, you know. Charming girl. I used to tell her she ought to have been in my house. Very cheeky answers I used to get back, too. Which was your house? I was head of Slytherin, said Slughorn. Oh, now, he went on quickly, seeing the expression on Harry's face and wagging a stubby finger at him. Don't go holding that against me. You'll be Gryffindor like her, I suppose. Yes, it usually goes in families. Not always, though. Ever heard of Sirius Black? You must have done. Been in the papers for the last couple of years. Died a few weeks ago. It was as though an invisible hand had twisted Harry's intestines and held them tight. Well, anyway, he was a big pal of your father's at school. The whole Black family had been in my house, but Sirius ended up in Gryffindor. Shame. He was a talented boy. I got his brother Regulus when he came along, but I'd have liked the set. He sounded like an enthusiastic collector who had been outbid at auction. Apparently lost in memories, he gazed at the opposite wall, turning idly on the spot to ensure an even heat on his backside. Your mother was Muggle-born, of course. Couldn't believe it when I found out. Thought she must have been pureblood. She was so good. One of my best friends is Muggle-born, said Harry, and she's the best in our year. Funny how that sometimes happens, isn't it? Said Slughorn. Not really, said Harry coldly. Slughorn looked down at him in surprise. You mustn't think I'm prejudiced, he said. No, no, no. Haven't I just said your mother was one of my all-time favourite students? And there was Dirk Criswell in the year after her, too. Now head of the Goblin Liaison Office, of course, another Muggle-born. A very gifted student. And still gives me excellent inside information on the goings-on at Gringotts. He bounced up and down a little, smiling in a self-satisfied way, and pointed at the many glittering photograph frames on the dresser, each peopled with tiny moving occupants. All ex-students, all signed. You'll notice Barnabas Cuff, editor of the Daily Prophet. He's always interested to hear my take on the day's news. And Fambrosius Flume of Honeydukes, a hamper every birthday, and all because I was able to give him an introduction to Syrian Harkis, who gave him his first job. And at the back, you'll see her if you'll just crane your neck. That's Grennog Jones, who of course captains the Holyhead Harpies. People are always astonished to hear I'm on first-name terms with the Harpies, and free tickets whenever I want them. This thought seemed to cheer him up enormously. And all these people know where to find you to send you stuff? Asked Harry, who could not help wondering why the Death Eaters had not yet tracked down Slughorn, if hampers of sweets, Quidditch tickets, and visitors craving his advice and opinions could find him. The smile slid from Slughorn's face as quickly as the blood from his walls. Of course not, he said, looking down at Harry. I've been out of touch with everybody for a year. Harry had the impression that the word shocked Slughorn himself. He looked quite unsettled for a moment. Then he shrugged. Still, the prudent wizard keeps his head down in such times. All very well for Dumbledore to talk, but taking up a post at Hogwarts just now would be tantamount to declaring my public allegiance to the Order of the Phoenix. And while I'm sure they're very admirable and brave and all the rest of it, I don't personally fancy the mortality rate. You don't have to join the Order to teach at Hogwarts, said Harry, who could not quite keep a note of derision out of his voice. It was hard to sympathize with Slughorn's costed existence when he remembered Sirius, crouching in a cave and living on rats. Most of the teachers aren't in it, and none of them has ever been killed. Well, unless you count Quirrell, and he got what he deserved, seeing as he was working with Voldemort. Harry had been sure Slughorn would be one of those wizards who could not bear to hear Voldemort's name spoken aloud, and was not disappointed. Slughorn gave a shudder and a squawk of protest, which Harry ignored. I reckon the staff are safer than most people while Dumbledore's headmaster. He's supposed to be the only one Voldemort ever feared, isn't he? Harry went on. Slughorn gazed into space for a moment or two. He seemed to be thinking over Harry's words. Well, yes, it is true that he who must not be named has never sought a fight with Dumbledore, he muttered grudgingly. And I suppose one could argue that, as I have not joined the Death Eaters, he who must not be named can hardly count me a friend. In which case, I might well be safer a little closer to Albus. I cannot pretend that Amelia Bones's death did not shake me. If she, with all her ministry contacts and protection... Dumbledore re-entered the room, and Slughorn jumped as though he had forgotten he was in the house. Oh, there you are, Albus, he said. You've been a very long time. Upset stomach? No, I was merely reading the Muggle magazines, said Dumbledore. I do love knitting patterns. Well, Harry, we have trespassed upon Horace's hospitality quite long enough. I think it is time for us to leave. Not at all reluctant to obey, Harry jumped to his feet. Slughorn seemed taken aback. You're leaving? Yes, indeed. I think I know a lost cause when I see one. Lost? Slughorn seemed agitated. He twiddled his fat thumbs and fidgeted as he watched Dumbledore fastening his travelling cloak and Harry zipping up his jacket. Well, I'm sorry you don't want the job, Horace, said Dumbledore, raising his uninjured hand in a farewell salute. Hogwarts would have been glad to see you back again. Our greatly increased security notwithstanding, you will always be welcome to visit, should you wish to. Yes, well, very gracious. As I say... Goodbye, then. Bye, said Harry. They were at the front door when there was a shout from behind them. All right, I'll do it. Dumbledore turned to see Slughorn standing breathless in the doorway to the sitting room. You will come out of retirement? Yes, said Slughorn impatiently. I must be mad, but yes. Wonderful, said Dumbledore beaming. Then, Horace, we shall see you on the 1st of September. Yes, I dare say you will, grunted Slughorn. As they set off down the garden path, Slughorn's voice floated after them. I'll want a pay rise, Dumbledore. Dumbledore chuckled. The garden gate swung shut behind them and they set off back down the hill through the dark and the swirling mist. Well done, Harry, said Dumbledore. I didn't do anything, said Harry in surprise. Oh, yes, you did. You showed Horace exactly how much he stands to gain by returning to Hogwarts. Did you like him? Harry wasn't sure whether he liked Slughorn or not. He supposed he had been pleasant in his way, but he had also seemed vain, and whatever he said to the contrary, much too surprised that a Muggle-born should make a good witch. Horace, said Dumbledore, relieving Harry of the responsibility to say any of this, likes his comfort. He also likes the company of the famous, the successful, and the powerful. He enjoys the feeling that he influences these people. He has never wanted to occupy the throne himself. He prefers the back seat. More room to spread out, you see. He used to handpick favourites at Hogwarts, sometimes for their ambition or their brains, sometimes for their charm or their talent. And he had an uncanny knack for choosing those who would go on to become outstanding in their various fields. Horace formed a kind of club in his favourites with himself at the centre, making introductions, forging useful contacts between members, and always reaping some kind of benefit in return, whether a free box of his favourite crystallized pineapple, or the chance to recommend the next junior member of the Goblin Liaison Office. Harry had a sudden and vivid mental image of a great swollen spider spinning a web around him, twitching a thread here and there to bring its large and juicy flies a little closer. I tell you all this, Dumbledore continued, not to turn you against Horace, or as we must now call him, Professor Slughorn, but to put you on your guard. He will undoubtedly try to collect you, Harry. You would be the jewel of his collection. the boy who lived. Or, as they call you these days, the chosen one. At these words, a chill that had nothing to do with the surrounding mist stole over Harry. He was reminded of words he had heard a few weeks ago, words that had a horrible and particular meaning to him. Neither can live while the other survives. Dumbledore had stopped walking, level with the church they had passed earlier. This will do, Harry. If you will grasp my arm. Braced this time, Harry was ready for the apparition, but still found it unpleasant. When the pressure disappeared and he found himself able to breathe again, he was standing in a country lane beside Dumbledore and looking ahead to the crooked silhouette of his second favourite building in the world, the Burrow. In spite of the feeling of dread that had just swept through him, his spirits could not help but lift at the sight of it. Ron was in there, and so was Mrs. Weasley, who could cook better than anyone he knew. "If you don't mind, Harry," said Dumbledore as they passed through the gate, "I'd like a few words with you before we part. In private. Perhaps in here." Dumbledore pointed towards a run-down stone outhouse where the Weasleys kept their broomsticks. A little puzzled, Harry followed Dumbledore through the creaking door into a space a little smaller than the average cupboard. Dumbledore illuminated the tip of his wand so that it glowed like a torch, and smiled down at Harry. "I hope you will forgive me for mentioning it, Harry, but I am pleased and a little proud at how well you seem to be coping after everything that happened at the Ministry. Permit me to say that I think Sirius would have been proud of you." Harry swallowed. His voice seemed to have deserted him. He did not think he could stand to discuss Sirius. It had been painful enough to hear Uncle Vernon say, "His godfather's dead," even worse to hear Sirius's name thrown out casually by Slughorn. "It was cruel," said Dumbledore softly, "that you and Sirius had such a short time together. A brutal ending to what should have been a long and happy relationship." Harry nodded, his eyes fixed resolutely on the spider now climbing Dumbledore's hat. He could tell that Dumbledore understood, that he might even suspect that until his letter arrived, Harry had spent nearly all his time at the Dursleys laying on his bed, refusing meals and staring at the misted window, full of the chill emptiness that he had come to associate with Dementors. "It's just hard," Harry said finally in a low voice, "to realize he won't write to me again." His eyes burned suddenly and he blinked. He felt stupid for admitting it, but the fact that he had someone outside Hogwarts who cared what happened to him, almost like a parent, had been one of the best things about discovering his godfather. And now the post hours will never bring him that comfort again. "Sirius represented much to you that you had never known before," said Dumbledore gently. "Naturally, the loss is devastating." "But while I was at the Dursleys," interrupted Harry, his voice growing stronger, "I realized I can't shut myself away or crack up. Sirius wouldn't have wanted that, would he? And anyway, life's too short. Look at Madame Bones. Look at Emmeline Vance. It could be me next, couldn't it?" "But if it is," he said fiercely, now looking straight into Dumbledore's blue eyes, gleaming in the one light, "I'll make sure I take as many Death Eaters with me as I can, and Voldemort too if I can manage it." "Spoken both like your mother and father's son, and Sirius's true godson," said Dumbledore, with an approving pat on Harry's back. "I take my hat off to you. Or I would, if I were not afraid of showering you in spiders. And now, Harry, on a closely related subject. I gather that you have been taking the Daily Prophet over the last 2 weeks?" "Yes," said Harry, and his heart beat a little faster. "Then you will have seen that there have been not so much leaks as floods concerning your adventure in the Hall of Prophecy." "Yes," said Harry again, "and now everyone knows that I'm the one." "No, they do not," interrupted Dumbledore. "There are only 2 people in the whole world who know the full contents of the prophecy made about you and Lord Voldemort, and they are both standing in this smelly, spidery broom shed. It is true, however, that many have guessed correctly that Voldemort sent his Death Eaters to steal a prophecy, and that the prophecy concerned you. Now, I think I am correct in saying that you have not told anybody that you know what the prophecy said?"
No, said Harry. A wise decision, on the whole, said Dumbledore, although I think you ought to relax it in favour of your friends. Mr. Ronald Weasley and Miss Hermione Granger. Yes, he continued, when Harry looked startled. I think they ought to know. You do them a disservice by not confiding something this important to them. I didn't want to worry or frighten them, said Dumbledore, surveying Harry over the top of his half-moon spectacles. Or perhaps to confess that you yourself are worried and frightened? You need your friends, Harry. As you so rightfully said, Sirius would not have wanted you to shut yourself away. Harry said nothing, but Dumbledore did not seem to require an answer. He continued, on a different, though related subject, it is my wish that you take private lessons with me this year. Private? With you? Said Harry, surprised out of his preoccupied silence. Yes, I think it is time that I took a greater hand in your education. What will you be teaching me, sir? Oh, a little of this, a little of that, said Dumbledore airily. Harry waited hopefully, but Dumbledore did not elaborate, so he asked something else that had been bothering him slightly. If I'm having lessons with you, I won't have to do occlumency lessons with Snape, will I? Professor Snape, Harry. And no, you will not. Good, said Harry in relief, because they were, He stopped, careful not to say what he really thought. I think the word fiasco would be a good one here, said Dumbledore, nodding. Harry laughed. Well, that means I won't see much of Professor Snape from now on, he said, because he won't let me carry on potions unless I get outstanding in my OWL, which I know I haven't. Don't count your owls before they are delivered, said Dumbledore gravely. Now I think of it, ought to be sometime later today. Now, 2 more things, Harry, before we part. Firstly, I wish you to keep your invisibility cloak with you at all times from this moment onwards, even within Hogwarts itself, just in case. You understand me? Harry nodded. And lastly, while you stay here, the Burrow has been given the highest security the Ministry of Magic can provide. These measures have caused a certain amount of inconvenience to Arthur and Molly. All their posts, for instance, is being searched at the Ministry before being sent on. They do not mind in the slightest, for their only concern is your safety. However, it would be poor repayment if you risked your neck while staying with them. I understand, said Harry quickly. Very well then, said Dumbledore, pushing open the broom shed door and stepping out into the yard. I see a light in the kitchen. Let us not deprive Molly any longer of the chance to deplore how thin you are.
Chapter 5. An Excess of Phlegm. Harry and Dumbledore approached the back door of the burrow, which was surrounded by the familiar litter of old Wellington boots and rusty cauldrons. Harry could hear the soft clucking of sleepy chickens coming from a distant shed. Dumbledore knocked 3 times, and Harry saw sudden movement behind the kitchen window. "Who's there?" said a nervous voice that he recognised as Mrs. Weasley's. "Declare yourself." "It is I, Dumbledore, bringing Harry." The door opened at once. There stood Mrs. Weasley, short, plump, and wearing an old green dressing gown. "Harry, dear gracious! Albus, you gave me a fright. You said not to expect you before morning." "We were lucky," said Dumbledore, ushering Harry over the threshold. Slughorn proved much more persuadable than I had expected. Harry's doing, of course. "Ah, hello, Nymphadora." Harry looked around and saw that Mrs. Weasley was not alone. Despite the lateness of the hour, a young witch with a pale, heart-shaped face and mousy brown hair was sitting at the table clutching a large mug between her hands. "Hello, Professor," she said. "Watcher, Harry." "Hi, Tonks." Harry thought she looked drawn, even ill, and there was something forced in her smile. Certainly her appearance was less colourful than usual, without her customary shade of bubblegum pink hair. "I'd better be off," she said quickly, standing up and pulling her cloak around her shoulders. "Thanks for the tea and sympathy, Molly." "Please don't leave on my account," said Dumbledore courteously. I cannot stay. I have urgent matters to discuss with Rufus Scrimgeour. No, I need to get going, said Tonks, not meeting Dumbledore's eyes. Night. Dear, why not come to dinner at the weekend? Remus and Mad-Eye are coming. No, really, Molly. Thanks anyway. Good night, everyone. Tonks hurried past Dumbledore and Harry into the yard. A few paces beyond the doorstep, she turned on the spot and vanished into thin air. Harry noticed that Mrs. Weasley looked troubled. Well, I shall see you at Hogwarts, Harry, said Dumbledore. Take care of yourself. Molly, your servant. He made Mrs. Weasley a bow and followed Tonks, vanishing at precisely the same spot. Mrs. Weasley closed the door on the empty yard and then steered Harry by the shoulders into the full glow of the lantern on the table to examine his appearance. You're like Ron, she sighed, looking him up and down. Both of you look as though you've had stretching jinxes put on you. I swear Ron's grown 4 inches since I last brought him school robes. Are you hungry, Harry? Yeah, I am, said Harry, suddenly realizing just how hungry he was. Sit down, dear. I'll knock something up. As Harry sat down, a furry ginger cat with a squashed face jumped onto his knees and settled there, purring. So Hermione's here? He asked happily as he tickled Crookshanks behind the ear. Oh, yes, she arrived the day before yesterday, said Mrs. Weasley, wrapping a large iron pot with her wand. It bounced onto the stove with a loud clang and began to bubble at once. Everyone's in bed, of course. We didn't expect you for hours. Here you are. She tapped the pot again. It rose into the air, flew towards Harry, and tipped over. Mrs. Weasley slid a bowl neatly beneath it just in time to catch the stream of thick, steaming onion soup. Bread, dear. Thanks, Mrs. Weasley. She waved her wand over her shoulder. A loaf of bread and a knife soared gracefully onto the table. As the loaf sliced itself and the soup pot dropped back onto the stove, Mrs. Weasley sat down opposite him. So you persuaded Horace Slughorn to take the job? Harry nodded, his mouth so full of hot soup that he could not speak. He taught Arthur and me, said Mrs. Weasley. He was at Hogwarts for ages. Started around the same time as Dumbledore, I think. Did you like him? His mouth now full of bread, Harry shrugged and gave a non-committal jerk of the head. I know what you mean, said Mrs. Weasley, nodding wisely. Of course, he can be charming when he wants to be, but Arthur's never liked him much. The Ministry's littered with Slughorn's old favourites. He was always good at giving leg-ups, but he never had much time for Arthur. Didn't seem to think he was good enough of a high flyer. Well, that just shows you. Even Slughorn makes mistakes. I don't know whether Ron's told you in any of his letters. It's only just happened. But Arthur's been promoted. It could not have been clearer that Mrs. Weasley had been bursting to say this. Harry swallowed a large amount of very hot soup and thought he could feel his throat blistering. That's great, he gasped. You are sweet, beamed Mrs. Weasley, possibly taking his watering eyes for emotion at the news. Yes, Rufus Scrimgeour has set up several new offices in response to the present situation, and Arthur's heading the office for the detection and confiscation of counterfeit defensive spells and protective objects. It's a big job. He's got 10 people reporting to him now. What exactly? Well, you see, in all the panic about you-know-who, odd things have been cropping up for sale everywhere. Things that are supposed to guard against you-know-who and the Death Eaters. You can imagine the kind of thing. So-called protective potions that are really gravy with a bit of booba-tuba pus added. Or instructions for defensive jinxes that actually make your ears fall off. Well, in the main, the perpetrators are just people like Mundungus Fletcher, who've never done an honest day's work in their lives and are taking advantage of how frightened everybody is. But every now and then, something really nasty turns up. The other day, Arthur confiscated a box of cursed sneakoscopes that were almost certainly planted by a Death Eater. So you see, it's a very important job, and I tell him it's just silly to miss dealing with spark plugs and toasters and all the rest of that muggle rubbish.
Mrs. Weasley ended her speech with a stern look.
To keep listening to this audiobook and the rest of the Harry Potter audiobooks for free, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.